In this video, we do a deep dive into the mind of Putin. We ask, is Putin crazy? Is he a good Christian man? And what his motives are. Larry Alex Taunton has some interesting points about not just kind of oversimplifying things and saying, oh, Putin's crazy, just like, the Islamist terrorists and everyone else that American politicians and media have called crazy in the past. And he points out in a clip that I cut out that the think tanks like Cato and others couldn't even figure out what Putin's move was going to be, which I kind of disagree with. I think, well, maybe the think tanks didn't know, but the people calling the shots knew, and I think they wanted it and provoked it, but that's another discussion. Anyhow, he says that we can understand Putin better if we look at history, at what other Russians did, which I agree in part, but also I disagree because Putin is a different person, and he's actually, since he's become president, become a different person himself. And some of the videos, the video clips that I put in this video, I think will help shed a little bit of light on his transformative process over the years. And also he refers to his ideological positions. So I'm not going to comment too much on who I think Putin is. I think it's clear from the clips that I've decided to put in this video, and you can listen and decide for yourself. But we kind of take a look at his psychological, philosophical, and ideological, religious, geopolitical, historical, and economic motivations. I encourage you to watch. I know it's a long video, but if you watch to the very end, I think the last two videos shed a lot of light on who he is. He's basically just a mafia thug, and like Seymour Hersh would say, he's a realist historian, say everything's motivated by, money and power, and political world leaders jockeying for these things. Now, others would argue that's oversimplified, and there's a lot more to the man, or to any man that's in power, and I would agree. But in this case, I really think that's kind of his overarching motivation, and everything else underneath is either just a mask, like a facade that he tells the public, or it's a justification of what he's doing. So I invite you to join us on this dark journey as we explore the mind of the Machiavellian Vladimir Putin.
One of the things that has really struck me in the news has been the Putin is crazy, narrative. I don't know if you've picked up on this, but following Russia's invasion of Ukraine, I wondered how long it would take before pundits started saying what they say about all of America's enemies, and that is that they're simply crazy. And it didn't take long at all before we started hearing this. The White House press secretary, she said that Putin might be suffering from some kind of COVID isolation. He needs to get out more. If he did, perhaps he'd be a better adjusted human being. And where most of us, most people, perhaps when they're not feeling themselves, in the pop culture, somebody, smokes a cigarette, or they take a nap, or they go on vacation, or maybe they sit down with a glass of wine and classical music. Putin, he invades another country, at least that according to the White House press secretary. The Daily Beast said that Putin is clinically insane. How they would know he's quote unquote clinically insane, I don't know. Have they examined him? But anyway, that's the narrative that they put out. Florida Senator Marco Rubio, a Republican, he bought into to this as well, and he said that something is off. That's exactly the way he put it. Something is off with Putin. The way he talked, he made it sound like him and Putin, they're bunkmates. He knows him really, really well. They're roomies. They go way back together. And my good friend Putin, something's off. South Carolina Senator, also a Republican, Lindsey Graham, who sounded a bit unhinged himself, he implicitly accepted, this diagnosis of Putin, and he moved from the something is off stage of things to someone needs to bump Putin off. He went on Twitter, Lindsey Graham, and said, "Would somebody please assassinate Vladimir Putin?" Then the Washington Post ran a speculative piece on the Russian dictator's mental stability. So this narrative was all over the place. And in case you have any doubts about it, media narratives are scripted to some extent. I don't know how many of you are paying attention, but the January 6th happens, and January 7th, did you notice that everyone was using the word insurrection? They were all using that word. They weren't saying a disruption at the Capitol. There were riots at the Capitol. There was a demonstration at the Capitol. They all used a single word, insurrection. Almost makes you think there were talking points, that were sent out to all the media outlets. And of course, there were. And so it is with Putin. Now that none of them seem to have anticipated Putin's invasion of Ukraine, the narrative is, well, that just is an indicator that Putin is crazy, that he's crazy. Now, I want to point out to you, just at a basic level of Russian history, one of the first things that you learn in Russian history, even if all you have is a superficial understanding of Russian and Ukrainian history, is that Russia has always viewed Ukraine as essential to Russia's security and survival. Words and phrases like breadbasket and warm water port appear, throughout any readings of Russian and Ukrainian history. Russia has always regarded Ukraine as vital to its survival. Is Putin crazy? I've never met the man. I've never read any reports of examinations of his mental health, but I'm inclined to say that the man is not crazy, and that is because I believe that the Putin is crazy narrative is intellectually lazy. It is the narrative that you hear about all of America's enemies. Before Putin, we heard this about Osama bin Laden. We heard this about Saddam Hussein. It is possible to commit heinous acts and to be perfectly rational. Let me repeat that. It is possible to commit heinous acts and to be perfectly rational, because I come back to this idea that I keep seeing everywhere that Putin is nuts. Now, I've said that it's lazy, and it is, because that narrative avoids the hard work of trying to understand our enemies and looking for the connective tissue in their actions. I, for instance, when I was teaching at university or teaching in a preparatory school, if I'd asked students, what were the motives, what were the Nazis' motives behind the final solution? What exactly were they doing? Well, if somebody had just written, well, they were crazy. Okay, all right. But then what? There was a kind of logic that they were working out, which has its roots in Darwinian thought. This idea that there is no God, there's no ultimate judgment in the next life for the things that you do in this one, that we're ultimately animals, we have no soul, and that there are higher species than others. These were all things that informed a logic, albeit a warped logic, that they were following, that they believed. So when we come back to this idea of Vladimir Putin as as nuts, it's lazy because we're not really looking at what is motivating him. When you're trying to understand Putin's actions from a purely Western secular perspective, it gets you nowhere. If, however, you look at Putin's actions historically, as I pointed out earlier, Peter the Great did this, Catherine II did this, Stalin did this, you begin to understand his actions make a great deal more sense. When you understand how vital Ukraine is to the Russians, how they have always viewed it as utterly essential to their existence, the actions make sense. Putin suddenly seems not crazy at all, but somebody who is acting in Russia's, not the world's, not NATO's, not the EU's, and certainly not America's best interest, but in Russia's best interest. And I'm not so sure he isn't acting in Russia's best interest. By that, do not interpret me as saying that I endorse what he's done. Putin's a killer. That's not my point. My point is that from a Machiavellian point of view, are Putin's actions rational? Yes.
How should we understand Vladimir Putin? I've even heard some Christian friends of mine saying that they're not sure, but they think that maybe he could be a good Christian man.
A significant number of conservatives in the United States have observed the way the media in the United States have really done nothing but parrot left-wing talking points, and who have, well, frankly, lied about a lot of things, who suppressed information and truth, particularly surrounding COVID and the lockdowns and things of that sort, that there was actually major censorship of any alternative viewpoints except for the one that the government was promoting. So
Right.
the assumption is that the media lies.
And
So the net result is, if the media is saying something, we can't trust it. So we've got to look for an alternative explanation. And that alternative explanation, the assumption is the media lies all the time. And since it's presenting Ukraine as the victim here, that must not really be the truth, which is an absolutely asinine way of thinking, frankly. But I think that's really the dynamic that's going on. When you add on top of that, that many of the really hardcore conservatives in the United States are particularly concerned about homosexuality and things of that sort, Putin comes out verbally against it. He starts looking like a hero against some sort of global homosexual movement trying to enforce this in all countries and all that sort of thing. So then he becomes the person who's moral. He's the one who's standing up for traditional morality. He's the one who's standing up for the truth of the gospel. All of these kinds of things. I've seen this in rhetoric on my own Facebook pages.
If people do not get involved in politics at all, they will think that maybe he is a cool, strong man with a steel fist who wants to bring peace. But in reality, he wants to kill and intimidate the civilian population for selfish purposes, as I see it. And he is one of the most godless person. And I wrote for myself that the analogy of David and Goliath is the most appropriate in the case of Ukraine and Russia.
This Putin talks about this Christian values and this his take against the homosexual agenda, etc. It's just rhetoric. There are a lot of homosexuals in his surrounding, in his friends. There are prominent figures in the Russian establishment who are homosexuals, and so far they feel just fine working together with Putin.
I really battle to see how, from a Christian perspective, Putin can be a good guy. If you look at the means by which he tries to achieve the goals that he set before him, it's just not good. It's not good. He has been charged by International Criminal Court, and he is wanted, and rightly so. And unfortunately, I think he is wanted at this point not for all of the crimes that were committed. There were so many crimes committed against civilians, and he's responsible for it as the chief commander. War is devastation. There's no joke about it. Killing is not a nice or pleasant thing, but unfortunately, how you kill also makes a difference. And the tortures, the rapes, mass tortures, executions of the civilians, which were made particularly in Bucha, and then Putin publicly, what's a right term in English? Award to this unit, which was in Bucha, with medals. I'm trying to speak not as Ukrainian now, but as a Christian and as somebody who would look from the outside. If you would look at that, I really battle how you could battle to understand how you could connect him and this sort of pattern, because unfortunately those are not exceptions. this pattern and goodness in the Christian sense. The information is out there, and I think if a person wants to at least get an idea, a non-biased idea, if they have some sort of level of critical thinking, they could read resources on both parties or from both parties and look, or three parties. So Ukraine, Russia, and Western media, maybe Chinese, Arabic media, Al Jazeera, etc. The information is out there. It's they don't want to know by choice, I suppose, and then come up with statements like that. So it's probably a statement out of ignorance. I don't think they would be able to conclude that based on a unbiased research.
It's absolutely nonsense. How good Christian manhood could like killed a lot of people. A lot of people were deported. A lot of children were deported. Mariupol and many small cities were just wiped out from the face of the earth. How it's possible? If we are talking about Christianity, we are talking about new heart and new motivation, right? But we have some evidence that Putin is a big follower of some magic, or how to say, some traditional Russians, I don't know how to say, yeah, magic or witchcraft or something like that. So because he believed that that evil forces on his side. So it's strange to hear that from Christians. For Putin, Christianity or religion in Russia is just another I just want to say electoral segment, but they do not have normal like process of voting and so on. So for him it's just shirma, yeah. For them it's just whale. He tried to show himself as traditional Orthodox, just because many people in Russia claim themselves as Orthodox. But I'm sure that he's not connected with Christianity at all. And we could see it here in Ukraine. So many sufferings, so many deaths, so many evil things. Just checked Bucha, Irpin, and so on. And this is his army, Russian army. And you even could see how he relate like himself to Russian army. He don't count people. He don't respect human life. So how we could claim he is as a Christian at all? I could not understand it.
First, the Orthodox Church in the former Soviet Union was a kind of special service by KGB. That's why a lot of popes of the Russian Orthodox Church, both in Ukraine, in Russia, and so on, they were actually KGB agents. That's why it has no connections with true faith, Christian faith. That's why I don't believe the narrative of we are only the right church and we are caring for people. And in Ukraine, they just or in Western countries they do something other things. If we speak about Putin and about Christianity, one of this Bible Testament is you should not kill people. And what does Putin do? He kills people both in his own country and in other countries, in Ukraine and so on. It has nothing to do with Christianity, first thing. And second thing, Putin thinks that Russia is so mighty that they have right to put their nose into the affairs of other countries. I mean, Western countries, Ukraine, Georgia, and so on. They think that they have right to judge about other people, about other countries, and so on.
I would ask them on what basis they are considered that he is a Christian man, because Hitler also support supported Lutheran Church and was supported by Lutheran Church. But we know that he was never a Christian. He killed a lot of people and he lied all the time. I think the same with Putin. Even if you look through his promises that he would never invade Crimea, that he would never attack Ukraine, or he would never be president more than like several terms or something like that. He constantly lying to his own people, to the publicity, and I do not think that Christian values support that. And even though, like, moreover, he is killing other people, and in his own country and in different countries, in Ukraine, in Georgia, in Moldova. So if you look, like there is some documentary movies about how he became president, how he killed his own people and oligarchs, and like this close circle to be where he is now. So there are a lot of evidence. But now, even if you Google the promises of Putin that he broke, you will find a lot of information in the open sources. And yes, I do not believe that this is the behavior of a Christian. He is just repeating Hitler's story, and then we know that the more people, like countries, try to appease like Hitler, to the bigger tragedy it went, because then more people died. It was not only Soviet Union, but it was a lot of people from US, from UK, from like a lot of different countries, because they try to be to lead this appeasement politics, to give him everything he wants and not to confront him.
I think that probably the farther you are from Russia, the more false opinions you can come up with about it. No one who is born in Russia doubts it. I mean, the Baltic countries, Poland, Ukraine, no one has any doubts about who Putin is and what he has done, not only to the neighboring nations, but to his own people too. And I don't know, it's hard for me to say what were the reasons that maybe it's conservatives that you say about yeah, but when you have it as a part of your everyday reality and not just news from overseas, you can't come up to such an opinion, I suppose. But some people tend to anyway, especially some elder people. Sometimes, yeah. I don't know, if Putin is a Christian, why? I can't see how. That's also false flags, I suppose. Yes, he had a narrative that this is Orthodox. He and the Russia are the last standpoint of real true Christianity, Orthodox Christianity. But that's just worse than propaganda. I can't see that he actually did anything in that regard.
His stance on Christianity is it's Russian Orthodoxy or nothing. Many of these people who see him as being on their side, if they were in Russia, he'd be shutting down their churches.
Putin talks about this Christian values and his take against the homosexual agenda, etc. It's just rhetoric. There are a lot of homosexuals in his surrounding, in his friends. There are prominent figures in the Russian establishment who are homosexuals, and so far they feel just fine working together with Putin.
Not Putin as a great Christian, yeah, sure. The guy who divorced his wife, who has a lover, yeah, sure. And all of his surrounding. Look at the journalist investigations. Almost all of them have mistresses, yeah, and all of that stuff. So guys, this is just utterly unacceptable.
Putin failed badly in his country. He got so many money, extra money, trillions of US dollars from the high price of the oil, and his governance, his work as a president in the Russian, he has just damaged. It's a crony capitalism. His friends became billionaires, but he failed badly. Russians, they live really poor, and somehow to justify why we are so poor, he invented this rhetoric. So we stay against the West, we stay against this homosexual agenda and stuff like that. It's whole thing. It's excuses for him, for his poor work as a president of Ukraine, because Russian people didn't live better than before him. For 20 years of his governance, people didn't start to live better. It's a kind of the way all dictators think. So we will start the small war which we win, and we kind of show our greatness, and we have the excuse why people live so poor.
How many wives Putin had? A lot of scandals on the post-Soviet Union, which connected with the pedophilia, are connected with Russian Orthodox Church. And again, all their propaganda are that they are not fighting against Ukraine; they are fighting with collective West. They have this term, collective West, and it's include United States, it's include European Union.
He's got how many, countless mistresses, and he's got he's been behind the murders of all of his political rivals. He's not, there's no fruit. There's zero fruit. There's fruit, but it's just all just stench, corrupt, rotten fruit. He's a liar. He's a murderer. He's an adulterer. You name it. I mean, and you even look at the Russian Orthodox Church, and there's nothing Christ-like about the Russian Orthodox Church. There's no fruit at all that shows that they have any understanding of what the gospel is and what grace and mercy are. And Americans get caught up in politics and in doing the right things. And because he's saying those, they want to believe it, especially when you have talking heads, trying to convince them. You believe what you want to believe, and you tend to pick out the news that substantiate your beliefs. And so I think a lot of Americans are starting to give into that, but they're just being played. He has absolutely, he's a manipulator.
For me, any question about is it true or not what Putin said, it sounds like you're listening the person who is like a serial, like this, how to say, maniac, like serial killer.
Liar.
Yeah, like killer. I would never think if it's true or not, the words that came from the mouth of, but that's what I think about this. Yeah, again, the short answer is like to ask murderer and killer, if even he, like, I don't know, like after the murdering of 10 people, he helped to cross the street to one grand lady, elderly lady. But yeah, it's a good question, because it's forced me to think also a lot, not about the Putin. It probably will sound strange, but let's say it's truth, and it doesn't describe 100% my perspective, but probably 90% or 80% of my friends in States, at least those who are Republican, they're more active in saying their views. Maybe I don't know about the other part of my friends who are support Democratic Party, but most of what I hear, and especially against Biden or something, and what I heard, one of the biggest topic that people was like discussing, and I was always like, as a Christian, I was thinking it's true. It sounds like a law, like okay, it's that the one party is against abortion or something, at least the president, like Trump. Another one is completely for abortion, like LGBTQ and different other things. And then Putin came, and it's really forced me to think. And again, it didn't force me to change my views about LGBTQ or abortion, but it's forced me to think that unfortunately, not always when people support something, the politic is really dirty thing, and unfortunately they really can use any topic. So Putin divorced. Putin is terrible in his family. Everybody know it. He's completely not like a lot of very, very bad people who support LGBTQ and abortion are much more better example of building the family than Putin. So they at least they can support it, but they have one wife, they have kids. And Putin is very, very far from the good family. So he divorced. He had many evidences about the what is the word when you people sleep with other like, and I think if it's not would be so hidden, we would know much more. And then he killed people now in Ukraine, and he killed people in Russia who against him, and then he say I'm against LGBTQ and abortions or something. I'm even not sure he's against abortion because it's not illegal in Russia. Probably basically there's the idea of LGBTQ. That's it. This is probably the only reason why people can like say that he is a good Christian, because he fight with all Christian organization who don't support him. And this is a nice example, because I really believe the church should be separated from government. And there is a very, very dangerous this trail path when the church become almost like not friends, but I don't think that church should be against the government always. And Putin allow only organization who is completely worship him. And all organizations, no matter Christians or not, who don't support him, who say at least something against him, are closed. He blamed that Zelensky or something want to fight with their Moscow Patriarchate, but they close church by church all the time, destroy every organization that don't support them. I don't really believe he fight with LGBTQ because it's his face. I just think this is just a topic. This is just he see that the most of people conservative. Okay, he say what the people like to hear, and he use it only to control people. Really, some moment of the time, I was thinking about the like complicated hidden motivation, very, very strategic. I really now more believe that he's just a regular human being, are angry, and when I say as a regular human being, I don't like justify him. I mean that his motivation can be more primitive than we can think. I think he just really, his authority was damaged. His like desire to be the savior of all Slavic nations were damaged. He saw that the one country that he expected will like worship him didn't want to do this, and that's it. And he just used, and because he did it in other parts of, my father from Georgia. He did it in Georgia, in Moldova. And I think this is just a big accident. I think they do it in many countries without war too. Yeah, I think honestly, as a Christian, I would say he's just a normal sinner who want to be accepted, who has kind of like these values to find love, but the one who didn't find the love in Christ, and having the power in his hands, he just want to force people love him and worship, and probably, yeah.
Well, apparently some American conservative Christians thinks that committing genocide and killing people in a neighborhood country is a Christian thing to do. What else can I say? I'm not going to go deep into Russia's statistics on, divorces and abortion and things like that. And alcoholism, all of that is number one in Europe or Eurasia, because most of the Russia is in Asia. But yeah, if the person calls himself a follower of Christ or a believer and says that the person that kills someone for absolutely no good reason and invades neighboring country for made up stupid reasons, even if it's an influence share between them and the states, and they think he's a good guy, well, God is their judge. I can't judge them. I don't think he's just crazy. I think he's drunk on power. And out of that comes what we're seeing.
Putin is not a Christian by any stretch of the imagination. He uses Christianity because it makes him more popular in Russia, where there is a veneer of cultural Christianity. Russia, in my understanding, is also not a Christian country. There's a semi-Christian culture, but the majority of the people, to my understanding, do not understand the gospel. They do not have a living relationship with Jesus Christ. That's what it means to be a Christian. Cultural Christianity is not biblical Christianity, and it will not save anybody when Judgment Day comes. Putin is very good at using Christianity and using Christian language to get conservative people around the world and in his own country to support him, and he loves portraying himself as this Christian knight fighting against the very liberal and anti-Christian West. And surely there are lots of problems in the West and a lot of movements in the West that we would condemn. But what is much worse is when Christians are being persecuted in Russia, when Protestants do not have freedom, religious freedom in Russia. When the Russian forces came into the Donbass and into Crimea, Protestants were being persecuted. Protestant universities, I know of one university in Crimea that had a lot of Western funding, $1 million invested in this Christian college in Crimea with great professors. I know many people who have studied there. They came in, college is shut down, and the property is taken away from the college and it's given to somebody else. That's what happens when Russia comes into Ukraine. Churches are shut down, there's religious persecution. That's the reality. Putin can say all he wants about being a Christian, but Christians in Russia, true Christians, are greatly limited in what they can do. They cannot evangelize, they cannot talk to people publicly about their faith, and the churches are controlled. You talk about the Russian Orthodox Church, that was infiltrated by the KGB during the Soviet Union. That's a common known fact. And the patriarch of the Russian Orthodox Church, as far as we know, is a KGB agent or has been a KGB agent. So he and Putin, who was also in the KGB, are really birds of a feather. And so they work together very closely so that they can control the religious space and the cultural space in that country.
In Ukraine, we never have persecution of the homosexuals on the governmental level, except when we were occupied by the Soviet Union or by Nazis. But nevertheless, it's not tolerated in our nation. It's just something wrong, and most people would agree on this. Maybe now with this propaganda, which founded by the different organizations from European Union or United States, some people would say, no, it's okay and stuff like this, but generally it's socially unacceptable. What about this incredible level of corruption? And like the higher class of people there could basically do anything to the regular people. They don't value life of human being. It's also not Christian. They don't value the dignity of human being. It's also not Christian. If you are not the member of this circle of the higher level of hierarchy, your life doesn't value. And this works even in a micro hierarchy. Like every policeman who's not just maybe even regular policeman, if he would kill somebody, he wouldn't be in jail because he's policeman, every judge and everybody else. And that's, we also partly have the problem of this corruption, not on so huge level as there. It become a little bit better and we try to fight it. But this is the difference, that we try to fight and they basically obey. And that's why it's the culture of slavery.
Absolutely not. Okay, so yes, they're always using this narrative, and they always talk about homosexuality and LGBT community spreading, and that Ukraine wants that. Actually, Ukrainians don't. Most of them don't, and this is not true. And yes, in Kiev they allowed some parades to happen, but still most of the Ukrainians that I know, and I know a lot of people, they are against it. There are some people that say it's okay, let them do what they want. I'm not supporting them, but they can do what they want. But most of the people say they don't like it. Putin, it's really obvious for me. He's not a Christian at all. Just look at him and how he treats his family, for example. He was asked by some journalists about his daughter or daughters, and he was asked, hey, why are these people living abroad? And instead of saying that he has daughters and trying to explain that, he was just trying to escape this question in his manner. And he, instead of saying daughters or naming them, he was saying these people, these ladies. And it just so inappropriate about, just hearing all this news and knowing how many news he faked. Like this narrative that there are Nazis in Ukraine, or this narrative that Biolabs were actively producing biological weapons, or the narrative of Ukrainians bombing themselves just because, I don't know, they want extra protection from Europe. And you realize that Putin supports all these lies. And when you see what's really going on here and you look at this news, it is very clear for you that he is a liar, and of course, such a big liar and such a good liar too, because he's so confident when he's talking. And yeah, if he was not a good liar, people would not believe him so willingly. Of course, if you are such a liar, I cannot say you are not just a Christian, but at least an honest man.
He might be a good person when he came, because he came on quite a democratic lozungs, but nowadays, and already from 2012 at least, he is definitely a bad guy.
Okay, what do you
He's
think?
bad not only to, for example, Ukrainians, which he is really, really bad, but he, on my opinion, is also bad to his own people. Well, because even before Crimea, they already had these repressions. They already started to close independent journalists. They already started the process of creating this foreign agent status, etc., etc. I don't say Russians are good. They probably, unfortunately, deserve what they have, and they unfortunately also brought it to other countries like Ukraine. But definitely, this guy doesn't love anyone, although he says he loves everyone.
It's actually interesting because the church in Putin's Russia, and in fact before the war in Ukraine, played a huge role in brainwashing people. They were the ones, in particular Ukraine, we had this, you're probably familiar with Russian Orthodox Church of Ukraine of Moscow Patriot. So they were the ones cultivating all the separatist movements and all kinds of narratives that came from Moscow about Ukrainians, that Ukraine is a failed state, that Ukrainian culture is a fake culture, it's just Ukrainian language is a dialect. It was all about, brainwashing people, and I think we did a good stuff by exposing to everyone what was Moscow Church and patriarchy all about, and I think it was just church in particular was bound to distribute and brainwash as many people as possible in Ukraine to destabilize the situation. That's one thing. And another thing is that his Christian values were only in words, not in actions. Actions were different from what he was saying, like defending people and stuff. In fact, he liberated us only from our possessions and our lives, probably, and good well-being. So he's a hypocrite. In these terms, he's a hypocrite. I don't think former KGB agent will ever eventually become first former KGB agent. He will always be a KGB agent. And second, that in Soviet Union he was formerly atheist. Everyone was atheist, and I think he was atheist too. Again, using the church just as his useful tool.
I think he's sociopath and he's psychopath. And I really think that he partly believed this narrative, and he pictured himself as some, messiah, savior, and as some great emperor who tried to renew his empire and who tried to capture maybe the whole world, maybe not, because actually they are talking about Poland and Lithuania in their news, guys, it's from their news, and they discussed the plan how they would invade Lithuania and Poland. They show the maps and how they would do it and explain it, and so on and so forth. Of course, I understand that it's like complete nonsense because they can't defeat Ukraine, so that's why they probably even will not get to the Poland, hopefully. But like they talk it in their TV shows and discuss the plans of invasion of Europe. So I think he's former KGB. He was grown up in the Soviet Union, and he had this mentality. And I think he is also partly infected by the Soviet propaganda. And also, he had basically unlimited power in Russia. He could do whatever he wants. And when people have something like this, especially if they're psychopaths and sociopaths, then horrible things happen. But it's not problem just that somehow he magically became the president. I think the whole system in Russian society built like this, that the worst people come to power, that the people who have low moral values, who are ready to do anything to gain power and money, they become on the top. And this whole system of hierarchy built like this, it's not incident. It's not something like unpredictably magically happened.
As far as you can understand, what do you think it is that's really motivating Putin? And what is it that he wants to achieve?
There are famous words by Putin that disintegration of Soviet Union was greatest geopolitical so it was a catastrophe for him. So I would just add that in my humble opinion, but Alexander will agree with me, and like millions of Ukrainians, that crazy guy, he just wants to restore Soviet Union. That's why he almost swallowed Belarus, for example, yes. And this is what he wanted to do with Ukraine, and somehow, pace by pace, expanding his power and influence just to restore Soviet Union, maybe not Soviet Union in that form, but some kind of Soviet Union, Russian empire, and he will be a great Tsar, great Vladimir, because we had Vladimir the Great in Kiev, who baptized our people. But I think he wanted to become like a Vladimir the Greatest or something like that. That's why Lavrov told to guys that he would consult only Peter the Great, Catherine the Great, and probably Alexander II, who was one of the most influential tsars.
I think he lives in his own built for him world. I don't think he knows the whole truth. I don't think he follows the news. I don't think he reads anything. I think all the information he has is coming from trustworthy for him sources. I don't think this guy is actually checking the internet every day or reading something except Russian newspapers and Russian whatever channels or something. I don't think he even is doing this. On my opinion, this guy stuck somewhere in 1990s. He probably truly believes in his idea that he is doing the good thing by bringing back or trying to bring back Soviet Union or system sort of Soviet Union. But I don't think he understands the modern world anymore. That's what I think. So I don't think he even can answer what he wants to achieve, because his answers during this 1.5 years, okay, less, 1 year, 2 months, all his answers were changing all the time. So he doesn't have exact reason, what exact aim in this, as he calls, special operation. It does change every time.
Putin said once, their greatest tragedy for me personally is the Soviet Union has fallen. So there is no Soviet Union anymore. That's why all these efforts now and earlier with Georgia in 2008 and so on were to resurrect the Soviet Union. And I think Putin sees Ukraine still as a part of Soviet Union, and that's why he has this right to judge what we should do and what we should not do. His rhetorics tells about this vision, or supposed vision, I think.
I think it's just another, Nazis and Biolabs and what were the other, he has all kinds of the influence of the West coming toward Russia with all our shame. He has a lot of reasons for attacking, but really he just wanted Novorossiya. He just wanted the coastline. He just wants to shut down Ukraine and take control of some prime real estate, I think, and regain the glory of the former Soviet Union. He wants to have a legacy that he's brought back he thinks the biggest crime of the 20th century was the breakup of the Soviet Union. And he wants to go down in history as the man who rebuilt that. That's all it is. He's just using any excuse he can find to convince people that he's doing the right thing, that he's the savior of the world. And I think he's got a lot of Russian people believing him. And I think he's trying to play the American people too. He knows that Americans, the right, conservative right is in control in the government right now. And I think he's playing them, by talking about how he's in his last public address, he was talking about reading scripture and how he's wanting to uphold the family. And I mean, he's saying all the right things for the conservative Christians to go, yeah, that's right, we need to support him. He's trying to sway them. And so he's just a master manipulator. He's trying to get the favor of his people and the people who are funding the Ukrainian military machine. So
I think Putin is a classic dictator, and he's a revisionist. He would like to return the past, as he knew it. He grew up in the Soviet Union. He is a product of the Soviet Union, and in his opinion, based on the games of the world, particularly the U.S., Soviet Union suffered and was dismantled. And he himself, Putin himself, in Munich on the security conference, he called that as the greatest tragedy, geopolitical tragedy of the 20th century. So I think by saying so, he outlined where he stands, and if that is the greatest tragedy, he is the guy to fix it for the Soviet Union in order to reestablish what was lost, reestablish this world power with its life and weight in the world, a power to be reckoned with. So that's what I think he's after.
Yeah, I think there are several motivations. One is that he needs external enemies. He needs, to some extent, a foreign war in order to unite people in Russia with him, around him, right? I mean, I think we've seen that many times in history. You know, when you have domestic problems, you attack somebody else because then your populace gets united. And he's, from the very start, he has created the West and the United States as an enemy. He has painted them as an enemy over and over again to keep people in Russia supporting him and united around him, because Russia has, you know, huge internal problems, corruption, cronyism, poor healthcare, hugely underdeveloped cities and towns and villages outside of St. Petersburg and Moscow, infrastructure that's falling apart. We keep hearing about fires and explosions. I mean, before the war, in you know, old folks' homes, and you know, radio towers catching on fire, and submarines and whatnot. Just a lot of significant problems, things falling apart. Lack of free speech, religious oppression, alcoholism, domestic violence. I mean, it's a society with huge problems. So he needs an external enemy to keep the fires down internally. That's one reason. And another reason, like you're saying, is that a free, Western, democratic, and very importantly, prosperous Ukraine on his border is a threat for him, because these things do not characterize Russia. But if they characterize the prosperous country on his border, then people in Russia start saying, why do we not have free speech? Why do we not have what our relatives and friends in Ukraine have? Because there's a lot of communication back and forth. So that is a real threat to him. Another part of it I see is that Russian national identity is imperial. It has been imperial for several centuries. And so along with Ukraine becoming more independent and more Western is this notion that Ukraine should be in our orbit, because it really is part of our world. So when it is not, that gives them another reason to come and bring Ukraine back into that orbit. And also, I've heard the opinion, which is very interesting, that Ukraine helps Russia to be a part of Europe and not so much a part of Asia, because it has been described that Ukraine is Russia's window on Europe. So if Ukraine has control over Europe or is in Europe, then that makes it a more legitimate part of the European world and not so much, you know, associated with the Asian world. So those are a few reasons that I know of that I think are very significant for Putin to have invaded Ukraine.
I think he's trying to prove his point that he's a great leader, that he can combine all these pieces of Soviet Union together. And I think, there is a saying that power corrupts and absolute power corrupts absolutely, and this is what happens with him. He's trying, I think it's his pride. He just wants to be seen as a great leader, and to, like a Lenin, to be in all the school books without a blame, and to write his own history.
Lavrov, it's a minister of external affairs. He was asked with whom Putin had a council before he started this war. He said he was counseling with Peter the Great, Elizabeth, Catherine the Great, yes, and he mentioned another one, a Russian emperor. Kind of hard to find in the real reason and logic of this schizophrenic, what is going on in his head. He resigned so Ukrainians exist as a nation. He said it's just a Russian who speaks in different language. and just Russian who has a different culture. So he refused to recognize Ukraine as a country, and he said it in several occasions, even to the George Bush, Jr., another one. He said, so Ukraine, it's not a country, it's a faith. So those who try to analyze, they just had this idea. So maybe one way to protect Moscow, it's had a long land before the army came to the Moscow. So he need to expand the border, and there are few good spots to attack Russia from Europe, and all of them goes either from Belarus or from Ukraine. As you know, all the wars came through Ukraine. Why just Timothy Snyder wrote this good book, like a Bloodland. And I think the only one justified reason to expand his empire, in a way to protect the Russia. And the second, I think this is the right point, which Dr. Glenn said, destroy Ukraine to such extent so it will be never built up again as a country. So then blockade Ukraine from the sea, from the Black Sea, kind of build the corridor, ground corridor from Russia via Mariupol, Mykolaiv, Kherson, Odessa to the Moldova, to this Transnistria area, which is kind of like a. So I think it's a reason. Second reason, I may think so. He need a population of the demographic reason. So he need more Slavic people in his country. Because Russia in a horrible decline of demographically. But as we see, both of these pretexts or both of these goals, they just not achieved by him. Even it became worse.
I can only make, I don't know, an educated guess. I can't hope on more than that. But I think that we should take his speech that he said right before the war began. And he never mentioned anything like resources. He never mentioned anything like power, like anything like that, like territory. All what he was saying about was like meta-historical narrative. Here are some false Russians who betrayed true Russians, and now the true big Russia that has no borders should expand until it can. And I don't know. Maybe we also should remember about what he told. He thinks is the biggest tragedy of the 20th century, and he told that this was the fall of the Soviet Union. So I think he has this. He's very rational in his actions, but he has some irrational motivations, like some mythical or orthodox, and together with that Soviet Russia that has no borders and expands to the places where people speak Russian. I don't know, something like that. Something very eclectic, like you can see sometimes on marshes. I don't know if it's the correct word, when people go out and they have the images of Stalin as a saint with this thing around his head. So I think it's in some regards, although not so comic, but in some regards it maybe mirrors what Putin has also in his mind. Some representation of Russia as a great power, and that the world is not important without Russia. It's a great power. I think so. I don't know if you can collect my answer in something meaningful, but yeah.
Revanchism. He wants to build again empire. He wants to have force, to be influential and to make Russia big again, how to say. So he just wants his ambition just to have power and to be on this position of president as long as he can. As we could see in Russia, they have many problems, internal problems in their country, corruption and so on. And the easier way to have power and to stay as president is just have small war and to win this war and to gain some new territories, some new victories, it will give you some scores, and you will be like a legitimate leader of Russian empire. So I would say that his main motivation is to have power, to stay in his position as long as he can.
Just to keep his power, just to, it's like it's like it's a day of cleaning the house, and my house is a complete like mess, and it's dirty. Everything is dirty, and my wife tells me, "Hey, you were supposed to clean it because we were talking about it." But I say, "Hey, there is something really bad that's happening in my neighbor's house, so I need to go there and to help." And I pretend that I go and help, but really what's going on is I'm escaping my responsibility here. This is the same thing that is going on in Russia. Putin was never taking care of his own country. It's dirty, it's a mess, it is not developing at all. Many people are struggling, but they are not willing to accept it. They just got used to live a poor life. And there are St. Petersburg city and Moscow that are good-looking cities. Not all of it. I've been to Moscow years ago, but there are a good amount of places that look great there. But if you go further, if you go east from there, Russia starts looking so bad. There are so many places where they don't have even the most basic basic structures, basic roads, and this all means that they are not taking care of the country, even though they have resources. And it's time to elect a new president soon, and Putin is realizing, hey, I want to keep being a president. I want to keep being the main guy here. I want to have access to all these systems, and I want to get more money. So he wants to put their attention on something else. And he decides to say, hey, yes, kind of, I don't have time for all of that, but I'm actively supporting Russian-speaking Ukrainians right now, which is like a lie. So that's how I see it.
He wants to subdue, to recreate Soviet Union. It's pretty clear. Soviet Union 2.0. Look at his pseudo historical talks and papers. I think he published some paper on history and how Ukrainians, Belarusians, and Russians are one people, which is rubbish. And it's basically capture Ukraine. What we see here next, before the war, they said we will never attack Ukraine. They attacked Ukraine. During the first months, they said we want only to liberate the Donbass and those Donbass so-called republics. But what we have now, he annexed 4 regions, 5 now with Crimea, Luhansk Oblast, Donetsk Oblast, Zaporizhia, Kherson, and Crimea. Well done. I think this is one of his step-by-step. He wants to grab more and more land, just as he did with Georgia in 2008, with the South Abkhazia and South Ossetia and Abkhazia. I think he will do the same thing to his other neighbors. If he can't recreate Soviet Union 2.0, he will grab as much land as possible to, for his people to I guess worship him, because this is Tsar number 2.
There's a lot of speculations about it. I know in your history of Russia, I just think that, there are a variety of things that he was thinking about. First thing was to bring Ukraine back into the sphere of Russian influence, because this whole narrative of being a forepost of Christian values is taken from the fact that, Kiev is where the Christianity came to this area, including Ukraine and Russia. So he needs, for his, conservative Christian nonsense, he needs to still have control over Kyiv as a cradle of Christianity. That's one thing. Second thing, it's Ukraine has always been in between, and if you know the history, it has always been the battlefield between different empires and different countries. Third one, as Russians for the 350 years, he hates Ukraine. He wants to, commit genocide and kill everybody that he can kill and turn everybody that he can turn. And I think the biggest one was he honestly and obviously thought that he would take Ukraine in 3 days. He wants to go down in history as a great leader. Maybe the one that recreated Soviet Union, or maybe the one that brought Ukraine back into its historical whatever. So yeah, I don't know, only God knows his real motives, but these seem obvious and legit to me.
I think that why all this started is not about territory, freedom, or whatever. Ukraine is the largest country in Europe, and plus it's third in the world for growing wheat for bread. And Ukraine has large deposits of shale gas, uranium, ore, and various types of metals. Is in these places of these deposits, these places are now being leveled with the ground. So the old cities were just destroyed to the ground because the Russians wants to take this territory for themselves, for the gas, for the metals. So this is all the reason, not about freedom, not about Nazis, more about money.
I think he did want to annex Ukraine. I think that was his initial goal. I have a feeling that he's dropping back and just saying, I want to annex eastern Ukraine and probably the coast as well. I think that makes good sense too. And then bide his time until he can take western Ukraine. I suspect that that's what he's going to do. I don't think he really believes he can take over all of Ukraine now, in light of what's happened. Maybe he still does. But I certainly think that his secondary objective, which he will claim will be his objective all along, was to liberate the Donbass and so on, and basically get control of the eastern half of the country. One theory that I saw early on coming from David Goldman, writes for the Asia Times under the name Spengler. Goldman suggested that Putin's ultimate strategy in Ukraine, if he can't simply take it over, is to cause so much destruction to infrastructure and everything else that it'll leave Ukraine impoverished and virtually impossible to rebuild. Because it's just trillions and trillions of dollars of damage, and where's the money going to come from? Yeah. He used the analogy of the 30 Years' War, where that's what Richelieu did within some sections of Germany, where he just had the area be so devastated that people were starving and there was really no prospect of rebuilding for over a century.
В Советском Союзе со священнослужителями сразу после революции. Времена изменились. Советские офицеры предельно корректны, они совершенно не настроены как-то зверствовать или святотатствовать.
Патриарх только что рассказывал, когда советские войска готовы были уже войти на острова, на архипелаг, почему-то они остались на берегу и пригласили священнослужителей из монастыря. Один из них поехал, и вдруг советский офицер ему говорит: сколько вам нужно времени, чтобы все собрать и уехать? Посчитали, там, попросили несколько дней, собрали все самое дорогое в святыне, и сами уехали, и все вывезли. Вы знаете, вот в этой связи я о чем подумал. Конечно, вот в эти тяжелейшие дни гражданской войны и богоборчества потом, когда были заложены вот эти семена раскола в российском обществе, семена единения всегда оставались с нами. В первую очередь, как раз благодаря Русской Православной Церкви. И вот то, что офицеры тогда позволили монахам уехать и вывести святыни, это лучшее свидетельство того, что семена единения, объединения, они никогда нас не покидали.
Кроме того, офицеры Красной Армии разрешили монахам без суеты и спешки проститься со святой для них землей. Под сумрачным небом русского севера, по подтаявшему льду, они с молитвой тронулись в путь. В те годы в нашей стране мало кто понимал значение веры в жизни людей. И Валаам, как истинное зеркало России, отразил это сполна. После окончания Великой Отечественной войны в монастырских корпусах разместили интернат для инвалидов, в который свозили со всей страны тех, кто не мог заработать себе на жизнь, за кем некому было ухаживать.
Как вы думаете, как мы в последнее время, в то время, пока Валаамский монастырь тоже был в руинах, да и страна пока была в руинах, как мы нравственно изменились? И вера, не обязательно даже православная, играет какой-то...
Может быть, я сейчас скажу нечто такое, что кому-то может и не понравится, но я скажу так, как я думаю. Во-первых, эта вера, она всегда нас сопровождала. она укреплялась, когда стране нашей, народу нашему было особенно тяжело. Были вот такие совсем жесткие богоборческие годы, когда уничтожали священников, разрушали храмы. Но одновременно ведь создавали новую религию. Вот коммунистическая идеология, она очень сродни христианству на самом деле. Свобода, братство, равенство. Справедливость. Это же все заложено в Священном Писании. Это все там есть. А кодекс строителей коммунизма? Это сублимация, это просто такая примитивная выдержка из Библии. Ничего там нового не придумали. Вот смотрите, Ленина положили в мавзолей. Но чем это отличается от мощей света для православных? Да, просто для христиан. Когда мне говорят, нет, вот в христианском мире нет такой традиции. Как же нет? На фонд поезжайте, посмотрите, там мощи святые есть. Да и у нас вот здесь вот тоже святые мощи. Сергей и Герман. По сути, ничего нового тогдашняя власть не придумала. Она просто приспособила под свою идеологию то, что человечество уже давно изобрело.
I remember when I was covering for the Times religion, which I did for a long time, going to Geneva to the headquarters of the World Council of Churches, and I was taken aside by a press officer there who said to me, well, if you're dealing with the Russian Orthodox Church, don't forget, every third archimandrite is KGB. At that point, 3 archimandrites walked towards us, and I was wondering which of those 3 was the KGB man, reporting to the KGB apparatus. No, it's a serious point. It does indeed indicate something which is relevant to the present situation, which is the relationship between church and state in Russia itself. The Russian Orthodox Church has got a close alignment with the Putin government. I don't know what to call it, a regime, because that sounds as if I'm trying to insult it. But the apparatus of the state and the apparatus of the Russian Orthodox Church are quite closely entwined.
Only when one takes into consideration a non-rational, non-secular dimension, I would say. From the secular perspective, Putin is non-understandable. Unpredictable. That's what puzzled many Western leaders, I think, because they could not read his mind, because they perceived him as one of themselves, a secular leader with a pragmatic approach to things, but he is not. He is driven by a sort of metaphysics. I would not call it religion, really. It's really a sort of metaphysical outlook, which I believe to be dangerous. And it's really interesting and helpful in this situation to analyze this metaphysical outlook, where it comes from. Yes, there is a component of kind of traditional Christianity in it, orthodoxy. Yes, he was brought up in a non-religious environment. As an atheist, he became a member of the Communist Party. He was a member of the KGB, and by definition, no one could be a believer in the KGB, as we know. And then his kind of career in the KGB changed when the Soviet Union collapsed. It seems that he got disappointed in the communist ideology. It is still clear from his statements, his addresses. And he became some kind of non-ideological personality. He had some experience of conversion, according to himself and the people who knew him. But what kind of conversion it was? I would argue that the sort of religion or metaphysics he converted in reflects much better the situation of post-Soviet or late Soviet religiosity than traditional Christianity itself. The Christianity which had been adopted by Prince Vladimir in Kiev, as you mentioned, more than 1,000 years ago. This post-Soviet sort of religiosity, I would argue, is very simplistic. I would call, just like Dietrich Bonhoeffer called cheap grace. He talked about cheap grace. I would talk about cheap spirituality that Putin adopted. It's ritualistic. It's superstitious. That's why people are amazed how much Putin observes, like numbers. It seems to be, it's crazy, but he seems to be very much in numerology. Like he started his campaign against Georgia on the 8th of 2008. And he started his campaign, the first troops were brought to Ukraine from the eastern borders on the 22nd of the 2nd of 22. So this kind of crazy numerology is very much embedded, it seems, in his spirituality. And also there are reports that he consults all sorts of spiritual charlatans who are not really kind of priests or traditional Christians. So it's a mix of kind of post-Soviet metaphysics, superstition, and I would call it dualistic worldview. The worldview that sees the world in black and white. And for him, certainly, for Putin, the world he sees is very quite Manichaean. It's dualistic. It means that there is a part of the world which is good, essentially good for him, and he believes this is Russia. And there is a part of the world which is essentially bad for him, and he believes this is the West. So essentially, his war against the West, because what he does in Ukraine is not just about Ukraine. It's about the West, essentially, about the conquering the West, about the retaliating the West. He wants to destroy it. through Ukraine. Ukraine is used as a proxy. And for him, what he does in Ukraine, what he does against the West, we should remember, the poisoning in Salisbury, of course. We need to remember all sorts of crimes against humanity. So it's a campaign, it's a global campaign. And for him, this is like a cosmic task, I would say. It's like it's a thing, a work with a cosmic dimension. Yes, he is a madman, but he's a calculating personality, and he is driven by this kind of worldview, which reflects what I've described.
Do you want to just sort of add a bit of the history there? Because I think for people to sort of get a sense of this, what happened 1,000 years ago when Vladimir the Great adopted Christianity and so on, or at least the account we have of that, helps to inform what Putin has in the back of his mind when he launches this invasion. Give us a bit of that background.
Well, a key phrase here is Holy Rus, R-U-S, and its center was Kiev for a long time, which is why Kiev is still so important to Putin now. In other words, Moscow, if you like, was a suburb of Kiev rather than the other way around. I'm not sure Moscow even existed 1,000 years ago, to be honest with you. So it's steeped in that kind of history. It was founded as, well, I don't think they had the concept of the nation state in 980 AD, if that was the right year, but it was certainly a unified entity. And I think you're quite right to say metaphysical or even mystical notion of the three parts of it being Belarus, Ukraine, and Russia, and they were ruled by the Tsar, who had a special duty from God to protect it from its enemies, and its enemies were to the west. I mean, indeed, to some extent, its enemies were Catholic. There were a lot of tension between the Poles, the Polish, and Lithuanians, who were both Catholic nations, or were, historically speaking, Catholic nations, regarded as the embodiment of what was being threatening to Holy Rus. There have been wars, the territorial boundaries have changed, shifted here and there, indeed, and shifted again after the Second World War. But basically the idea is that there is a holy space whose soil is holy, whose people are holy, and whose church is holy, and they're unified under the Moscow Patriarchate. Now, the interesting question is, to what extent does this ideology, metaphysical ideology of Putin, chime with the understanding of the Russian Orthodox Church Moscow Patriarchate, and to what extent is he very much, as I think wouldn't be surprised to find, an outlier in terms of that ideology? I know we can find remarks by Moscow Patriarch spokespeople saying that there is such a thing as Holy Rus and it ought to be protected from its enemies, but I don't know that the whole package that you so eloquently describe, Cyril, is subscribed to by, shall we say, Patriarch Kirill. And I think that is an interesting question. Is there full support from the religious authorities in Moscow for Putin's attitude, approach, policy, outlook, and indeed policy? That's the key question now. Or is there in fact a tension between him and what I would have thought of as the much purer kind of Christianity that is represented by the Moscow Patriarchate? And I can't tell, and you might be able to give some glimpse on this, Cyril, to what extent the Moscow Patriarch share Putin's outlook.
Yes, indeed, there is certainly a connection, to say the least. Well, I mentioned that Putin was disappointed when he left, the party and switched to another sort of activity. He became a kind of a member of the local mafia group in St. Petersburg. He became disappointed in any ideology, in communist ideology, and for a long time he remained, I would say, a non-ideological person. Even when he became the president in 2000, I don't believe he really aligned with any ideology. But what happened then? There was an offer from the Russian church, an offer of a sort of ideology to substitute the communist ideology. This ideology was created, designed from the beginning by the Russian church. Well, essentially, to be more precise, the Russian church took an ideological construct which had appeared in the 90s, had been constructed by some liberal political scientists in Russia in the 90s, the concept of the Russian world, and changed it, refurbished it to a kind of fully fledged ideology, which was probably not exactly an ideology. Again, it's more appropriate to call it mythology. And it includes exactly this idea of the Holy Rus, as mentioned by Clifford, the idea of the sacred space to be protected, and the Russian church, and particularly Patriarch Kirill himself, he's the father, and the church is actually the author of this ideology. And the Russian church managed to offer, I would say, to sell this ideology to Kremlin, to Putin. And Kremlin adopted it. I remember very well because I worked in Moscow at the time. And I remember very, very well the moment, or the period, a very short period of time, when the Kremlin adopted the language of the church in describing its political goals. At some point, there was a convergence of rhetorics of the church and of the Kremlin, with the church playing the leading role in producing this rhetoric. And when they listened to Putin just a week ago, before he launched his attacks against Ukraine, I heard the voice of the church. I heard the argumentation, the tropes, which had been produced by the church. So what the church has done, the church has supplied the Kremlin, which was completely unideological, which was concentrated, on earning, gaining, economic wealth and, exporting money to the West, including the UK, and exporting oligarchs who landed in the UK and, filled with their money the coffers of the British banks. And it's not just about British, it's just an example. That was the concern. But then when the church stepped in, it framed essentially this situation, this policy, in ideological terms, and added metaphysics to this. And this metaphysics seems to drive Putin. And so when that war began, then it was clearly underpinned by this ideology of the Russian world. Many people came to fight in the east of Ukraine with the idea that they are protecting the sacred space of Holy Rus, and they fight against a godless, demonic, diabolic West. That was the idea that drove many to the east. And that idea was inspired, I'm afraid, by the church.
The earliest narrative you gave me was of the Russian Orthodox Church Moscow Patriarchate influencing Putin. But now you're saying it's the other way around. It's the influence of Putin on Moscow Patriarchate.
Exactly. It's reciprocal.
Am I right?
It's reciprocal. The moment you influence someone, you get influenced by, especially the symphonic relationship that the Moscow Patriarchate has with the Kremlin. It is unfortunately reciprocal. Yes, Moscow provides, the Moscow Patriarchate provides the Kremlin with the rhetoric, with the language, and instead it gets affected by the ideas, by the ideologies. It comes back as a boomerang.
And do you feel, Cyril, at this point that, Clifford felt that Kirill had not been outspoken in support of this, but do you think there is actually that at this point, Kirill and the Moscow Patriarchate is actually essentially supporting, endorsing, encouraging this war in Ukraine?
I'm sure about that, unfortunately.
Insults and over-the-top outrage is standard for Russia's state TV talk shows, but this episode was especially ferocious, with the target Canada's ambassador to Moscow. People like her will be banished to hell, where they'll burn eternally, screamed the Deputy Speaker of Russia's parliament. Ambassador Alison Leclerc flew a rainbow flag outside of Canada's embassy and posted this video to mark June as Pride Month. But she also included a comment on Russia's about-to-be adopted ban on gay marriage.
And proposals for constitutional amendments that, if adopted, would lead to an increasingly less inclusive national legal framework.
When she gives directions on voting, said the Kremlin-connected journal editor, that's not the role of a diplomat. She should be reprimanded. The amendments would allow Vladimir Putin to remain as president practically until he dies, but they'll also entrench so-called traditional conservative values into the Constitution. I will repeat it again. While I'm president, we will not have parent number 1 and parent number 2, said Putin. It will be mom and dad.
Поэтому ведут против нас все более агрессивные информационные атаки. Целью выбирают прежде всего, конечно, молодых людей, молодые поколения. И здесь опять лгут постоянно, извращают исторические факты, не прекращают нападки на нашу культуру, на русскую православную церковь, другие традиционные религиозные организации нашей страны. Посмотрите, что они делают со своими собственными народами. Разрушение семьи, культурной и национальной идентичности. Извращение, издевательства над детьми вплоть до педофилии объявляются нормой их жизни. Хочется им сказать, но посмотрите, извините меня, священное писание, главные книги всех других мировых религий. Там все сказано, в том числе то, что семья – это союз мужчины и женщины. Но и эти священные тексты подвергаются сейчас сомнению. Но вот, как стало известно, англиканская церковь, например, планирует, правда, пока только еще, рассмотреть идею гендерно-нейтрального Бога. Что скажешь? Прости, Господи, не ведают, что творят.
He said Western nations are using Ukraine as their puppet. Yeah, I think so. I think Ukraine might be a part of that, but there's something dirty going on here. He said they distort historic facts and constantly attack our culture, the Russian Orthodox Church, and other traditional religions of our country. I haven't heard any of that anywhere. They cannot ignore the fact that Russia cannot be defeated on the battlefield. Well, I don't think I agree with that either. So they're waging increasingly aggressive information attacks. First, all targeting the young generations, lying on every step, distorting historical truth, attacking our culture, the Russian Orthodox Church, and other traditional religious institutions in our country. Now, that was for his people. Then he says to his people, and look what they're doing in the West to their own people. It's even worse. Look at what they're doing. They're destroying the institution of family, their cultural, historical identity, and the destruction of the family, the national identity, the perversion and abuse of children up to pedophilia are now accepted as a new norm. And he goes on, and priests are forced to bless same-sex marriages. As it became known, the Anglican Church plans to consider the idea of gender-neutral God. Millions of people in the West understand they are being led to a real spiritual catastrophe. I think all of that is true. He then says, maybe we should take a look at this. Maybe they should take a look into the scripture, into the holy book of any religion. It says that family is a union between a man and a woman, and these holy texts are now being increasingly doubted in the West. The Anglican Church is considering a gender-neutral God? Okay, there is nothing false about that last part. And on the surface, if you're just wondering, where is a leader that is going to stand up against this stuff? You hear Putin say it and you're like, okay, he's a really bad guy, but listen to what he's saying. All he's doing is describing the evil of Marxism that has taken hold in the Western world. Yesterday, NPR praised puberty blockers and sex change surgeries for children. Most sane people are tired of the leftist takeover of culture, and Putin knows it. His message is so dangerous. It is a bait and switch. So what is it that he's actually saying? What is it he's trying to accomplish here? This is so critically important because it's like a KGB influence operation. Putin's goal is to gain allies and to seed doubt. They might agree with you on several points, but when it gets down to the details, the devil literally is in the details. Putin's goal is to frame Russia as the Roman Empire, battling all the evils and depravities of the Western world. But I want you to be very clear on this. That is the wicked punishing and killing the wicked. He might be speaking words that are true, but he himself is a false prophet and a liar. He is not a supporter of the rights that only come from God. He's a bloodthirsty killer. Freedom of speech, he murders anyone who disagrees. We merely silence them through cancel culture or through private-public partnerships. They're both evil. And he is doing exactly what I have warned you of for the last almost 10 years. And these tactics are traced back to one guy. I have told you he is the most dangerous man in the world. He is a radical philosopher named Alexander Dugin. He is Putin's bizarre mystical guru. In his book, Foundations of Geopolitics, Dugin pushed the idea that the U.S. must be counteracted on the global stage. And the book became a standard-assigned reading in the 21st century at the General Staff Academy for Russian military leaders. So all of the military leaders have been raised on Dugin. He went on to become a Putin advisor without portfolio, with Putin echoing, sometimes in a matter of hours, according to experts, expressions Dugin was using in his media broadcasts. The West is the Antichrist and must be destroyed, but all of modernity, everything modern, must be destroyed. Dugin, Putin do not believe in the traditional values, the religious values, but they know how powerful this message is. They are selling you a cathedral that is actually a windowless concrete building with a basement that you don't want to know what's going on in the basement. KGB, Putin, been using Russian Orthodox Church as a weapon for years, and using clergy as intelligence assets. It's just another flavor of Malthusian poison. We just have to kill a lot of people, and then we'll have utopia. Traditionalism is easily anti-capitalist, anti-Christianity, anti-anything it wants. But it is a return to the medieval world first, Russian Renaissance second. These people are not your friends. They do not mean what they say. They do not speak for you. Traditionalism with a capital T wants to use war to launch the world out of the Dark Age, because he believes we're now living in the Dark Ages, the whole of modern world. He believes that global conflict is inevitable. Violence is a requirement. The literal apocalypse is just merely a phase. Warning all conservatives. Capital T traditionalism. Alexander Dugin, Vladimir Putin are not your friends.
The Americans who doubt Putin would use a nuclear weapon come back to that famous moment last February when Putin publicly ordered his generals to place Russia's nuclear forces on alert.
We didn't put them on alert. Our folks, we talked about the CIA, our intelligence agencies, have no higher priority than to keep track of nuclear weapons in Russia. They watch it they know where they are, and they know what it takes to put them on alert, and it didn't happen. It didn't happen. It was saber-rattling as a bluff. It was a bluff.
Sometimes this question comes down to an assessment as to whether Putin has become mentally unbalanced enough to use a nuclear weapon. Again, former U.S. National Security Advisor John Bolton thinks not.
But I've met with him on a number of occasions. I don't see that there's a mental issue here. In conversations I've had with him, and he does speak English, but where we've reached disagreement on something like arms control, he has said, well, you have your logic, we have our logic, we'll see which one prevails.
While most experts doubt Putin would use a nuclear weapon, many have lingering doubts they might be wrong. Most experts thought he would not invade Ukraine, and he did. Many believe he would only use nukes if he thought his government was about to be deposed, and wonder if the war can be safely brought to a close without regime change in Moscow. Western experts who watch Vladimir Putin very closely puzzle over how he seems to have miscalculated so badly in getting himself into the Ukraine war. Many go back to his long period of isolation in the 2 years leading up to the invasion, often appearing in public by himself, even when attending religious services, meeting other world leaders and even his own advisors at the end of long tables, because he was apparently somewhat paranoid about catching the COVID virus. He was studying Russian history and said he came to the conclusion that Ukraine was not a real country and should be part of Russia.
Поле битвы, на которое нас позвала судьба и история, это поле битвы за наш народ, за большую историческую Россию.
At various points in the last year, Vladimir Putin has suggested that Russians are just taking back what is properly theirs. He used the example of the territory seized from Sweden by Russia in the time of Peter the Great.
Вот, ну, судя по всему, на нашу долю тоже, выпало.
He laid out his theories of Russian history in a long treatise published a few months before the February invasion.
And I think this obsession with history, it's all about what you might call dictator syndrome. He was very isolated during the pandemic, really saw almost no one, and was calling out books, papers, immersed in the past, if you like. And what's interesting about Putin is that he's not really anymore in the world of geopolitics. He's in some sort of, I call it a sort of strange and unreachable realm, where he's thinking about his role in Russia's sort of great history and how he measures up to people like Ivan the Terrible or Peter the Great or even Stalin.
Longtime Putin watcher Sir Lawrence Friedman is Emeritus Professor of War Studies at the University of London.
Putin, once in a lifetime moment, and his lifetime may not be that much longer, once in a lifetime moment, to solve the Ukraine problem in a way that corrects all this historical nonsense and brings it back into the fold. At least he'd got that into his head. It seemed that he just pursued it to the point that very few people around him, other than the most immediate courtiers, really seemed to have a keen idea of what he was doing.
I mean, there's a sort of paradox at the heart of this war, this invasion and events last year, is that Putin considers himself to be a brilliant spy. And yet it appears that his domestic spy agencies had told him that Ukrainians would rise up and welcome their Russian liberators, would cheer Russian tanks, give the soldiers flowers, praise them, etc. And of course, it didn't happen like that. He thought he was just fighting a corrupt pro-Western government and the Ukrainian army. In fact, he now knows, he's discovered, to his great cost, that he's fighting an entire country of 40 million plus people.
Former U.S. National Security Advisor John Bolton has dealt with Russian leadership for many years. He says that many of Putin's advisors, like Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov, actually share their president's dreams of old-style Russian imperialism, especially when it comes to Ukraine.
Lavrov, for a time, was my counterpart. And the briefing assessment I got of him then, this would be 1990 or thereabouts, was we assess that Lavrov is not a communist, we assess he is a czarist. And I would say that about all of them. They think that the United States and the West were responsible for the breakup of the Soviet Union. They think that was illegitimate. They think Ukraine is an illegitimate state, and so are the other independent republics, and they intend to do something about it. That's what they think.
Putin comes out and says, listen, I have some demands for the West. And everyone's like, okay, Russia, what are your demands? You know, we have like COVID-19 right now, and like that's like surging. So like, we don't need your like bluster about what your demands are. And Putin's like, no, here's my list of demands. Putin's demands for the summit were this. Number one, that NATO, which is this big military alliance between US, Canada, and Europe, stop expanding, meaning they don't let any new members in, okay? So Russia's like, no more new members to your like cool military club that I don't like. You can't have any more members. Number two, that NATO withdraw all of their troops from anywhere in Eastern Europe. Basically, Putin is saying, I can veto any military cooperation or troops going between countries that have to do with Eastern Europe, the place that used to be the Soviet Union, okay? And number three, Putin demands that America vow not to protect its allies in Eastern Europe with nuclear weapons. LOL, said all of the other countries. You're literally nuts, Vladimir Putin. Like, these are the most ridiculous demands ever. But there he is, Putin, with these demands, these very, very aggressive demands. And he sort of is implying that if his demands aren't met, he's going to invade Ukraine. I mean, it doesn't work like this. This is not how international relations work. You don't just show up and say, like, I'm not going to allow other countries to join your alliance because it makes me feel uncomfortable. But what I love about this list of demands from Vladimir Putin for this summit is that it gives us a clue on what Vladimir Putin really wants, what he's after here. All these ex-Soviet countries are now joining NATO, and some of them the EU, and Putin is hating this. He's like, not only did the Soviet Union divide and all of these people are now outside of the Russia motherland, but now they're being persuaded by the West to join their military alliance. This is terrible news. Over the years, this continues to happen while Putin himself starts to chip away at Russian institutions, making them weaker and weaker. He's silencing his rivals, and he's consolidating power in himself. And in the past few years, he's effectively silenced anyone who can challenge him. Any institution, any court, or any political rival have all been silenced. It's been decades since the Soviet Union fell, but as Putin gains more power, he still sees the region through the lens of the old Cold War, Soviet, Slavic Empire view. He sees this region as one big block that has been torn apart by outside forces, the greatest catastrophe of the 20th century. And the worst situation of all of these, according to Putin, is Ukraine, which was like the gem of the Soviet Union. There was tons of cultural heritage. Again, Russia sort of started in Ukraine. Not to mention, it was a very populous and industrious, resource-rich place. And over the years, Ukraine has been drifting west. It hasn't joined NATO yet, but more and more it's been electing pro-Western presidents. It's been flirting with membership in NATO. It's becoming less and less attached to the Russian heritage that Putin so adores. And more than half of Ukrainians say that they'd be down to join the EU. 64% of them say that they would be cool joining NATO. But Putin can't handle this. He is in total denial. Like an ex-boyfriend who can't handle his ex-girlfriend starting to date someone else, Putin can't let Ukraine go. He won't let go. So for the past decade, he's been trying to keep the West out and bring Ukraine back into the motherland of Russia. And honestly, if you really want to understand the mind of Vladimir Putin and his whole view on this, you have to read this. On the History of Unity of Russians and Ukrainians by Vladimir Putin, a blog post that kind of sounds like a 9th grade history essay. In this essay, Vladimir Putin argues that Russia and Ukraine are one people. He calls them essentially the same historical and spiritual space. Kind of beautiful writing, honestly. Anyway, he argues that the division between the two countries is due to, quote, a deliberate effort by those forces that have always sought to undermine our unity. And that the formula they use, these outside forces, is a classic one: divide and rule. And then he launches into this super in-depth, like 10-page argument as to every single historical beat of Ukraine and Russia's history to make this argument that, like, this is one people and the division is totally because of outside powers, i.e. the West. Okay, but listen, there's this moment at the end of the post that actually kind of hit me in a big way. He says this: just have a look at Austria and Germany, or the US and Canada, how they live next to each other. Close in ethnic composition, culture, and in fact sharing one language, they remain sovereign states with their own interests, with their own foreign policy, but this does not prevent them from the closest integration or allied relations. They have very conditional, transparent borders, and when crossing them, citizens feel at home. They create families, study, work, do business. Incidentally, so do millions of those born in Ukraine who now live in Russia. We see them as our own close people. I mean, listen, like, I'm not in support of what Putin is doing, but like that's like a pretty solid like analogy.
Yeah. There are some nationalists, European nationalists and other nationalists, who they seemingly take a stance against global liberalism by asserting the primacy of the nation and its traditions. One thing that's not so easy to see for people who are newcomers to Dugin is that he is not a nationalist, and he recognizes that nationalism can sometimes be exploited by the hegemonic imperialist forces. And so it's not like, in some sense, nationalism is not enough for him. He likes big civilizational blocks because small nationalisms are not sovereign enough to really assert themselves outside of the gravitational pull of the real bearers of sovereignty in the world. So
I think I might just push back on that. He might not be a nationalist in the narrow sense, because his understanding of Russia, as far as I can understand from his book, is not that Russia is just a nation, but it's an imperium, it's an empire, and it's much more than just a narrow sectarian ethno-nationalist state. Therefore, it would be accurate, perhaps, to say, I'm looking at the last section of The Great Awakening, this book, Russia Awakening, an Imperial Renaissance. He's an imperial nationalist, I suppose, if that such a term exists. He's all for the Renaissance of Russia, and this comes in perhaps into the last section, really, where unavoidable given what's going on in the world at the moment. There's a relationship, the intellectual or other relationship of Dugin with Putin himself, and I know there are a lot of tropes in the Western media which are, frankly, a bit silly, Putin's brain and all that. But he doesn't actually, as far as I'm aware, hold any. Dugin doesn't hold any official office in the Kremlin. He's not a government spokesman. He's not part of the cabinet or anything. He's like an independent thinker, if that's the right word. But what is the relationship, if only intellectual, between Dugin and Putin, and how much of this of Dugin's project is endangered by the fortunes or misfortunes of Putin himself, and of course brackets Ukraine, etc. Because he's not living in an ivory tower. This guy Dugin is dealing with real world events, and at the moment, I don't know what's really going on. I don't know what's going to happen in the future. But if things turn out badly for Putin, who knows what will happen to Dugin?
Yeah, that's right. So let me say a few things. The first one is that there is a kind of history of Dugin's institutional influence, by which I mean he met with such and such a party leader, he helped with such and such a platform, he was invited to speak here or there in government circles. The best account that I know of, or the one that I enjoyed the most at any rate, is in Charles Clover's book, Black Wind, White Snow. And then you can see, for example, Dugin helped to write the platform of the Communist Party of the Russian Federation. And he influenced these other figures. So that's at the level of like direct institutional influence. He met with this person met with this person. But I think that is, for me at any rate, less important and less interesting than a different kind of influence that intellectuals can exert on holders of power. And the idea here is that Dugin has, over 30 odd years and 50 odd books, articulated a vision for a world in which Russia can assert its civilizational independence and sovereignty. The various dimensions of that, including what it would mean for international order, what it means for understanding the history of the West, what it means philosophically, sociologically, ethno-sociologically, etc. That's what he's written about. So now you ask the question, what's his influence on Russia? And I would put it this way, that whenever Putin decides to act as though Russia is a civilization and not just a country in the global order, then somehow automatically the ideas that are going to be there for him to draw on, whether because he's aware of them directly or indirectly, maybe because they've percolated over 30 years through a variety of authors, think tanks and institutions, or just because Dugin has prepared the conceptual field so that as soon as somebody starts thinking, what would it mean for Russia to go against the West? What are the key concepts, the key words, the key policies, the rhetoric, the ideas, and the ideologies? He's the one who has prepared that field, and it just starts raining down, so to speak. So Dugin has, in that sense, provided the true north for a Russia that wants to break from the West without doing it as a nation, as in small nation, like you said, without doing it in ethno-nationalist terms, and without doing it in terms of the rejected ideologies of the past. Another way, like Dugin has sometimes said, he doesn't answer the question whether he knows Putin, whether he's met with him, and so on. He doesn't answer that question when he's asked in interviews.
Michael, why doesn't he answer that question? I mean, look, if not answering it is evasive, and that suggests, why is he not answering that question?
I'm not sure. I'm not going to speculate, but I'll tell you that what he does say is that as somebody who's analyzed the trends of global politics and of Russian history, he says he sees further ahead on the basis of the logical extrapolation of the meaning of Russia's history. And so when Putin acts consistently with that, it's going to look like he's walking in lockstep to a certain extent with Dugin's ideas. Right. And it's not always the case. So Dugin has a book called Putin versus Putin, where he said that Putin is Eurasian by half. He stopped Russia from collapsing. He made Russia strong again. Okay, he did all kinds of things to restore the possibility of Russia's civilizational sovereignty in the world. This is before the war, okay? But he's surrounded by all kinds of liberal Putin whisperers, and he sometimes thinks that Russia is a European country. So this book, Putin versus Putin, said there are these two Putins, and he hasn't yet decided which one of them. Maybe that's his only place in Russian history, is that he restored the possibility. But now I think Putin, in some sense, has crossed the Eurasian Rubicon, and he has fully put Russia on the path of Russian civilization against the West. That seems clear from his recent speeches, particularly from the speech of the annexation of the Ukrainian regions. It's clear for anybody who watches that the anti-Western rhetoric is now
very strong,
quite, right? It's been dialed up. So in that sense, Putin versus Putin has been resolved, right? If it was like Eurasian Putin versus Western Putin, we now see, it's the Eurasian Putin. So the real risk, I would say, to Dugin, if we ask the question that you asked, right? What can we infer about Dugin's fortunes as a function of Putin's fortunes? If Russia, and Dugin seems to be pretty aware of this, if the current Russian war or special military operation is a failure, in other words, if it's a victory for a unipolar world, if it's a victory for Western Europe, if it's a victory for nationalism, Ukrainian nationalism, if it's a defeat of Russia's attempt at a multipolar world, that would be a big blow for Dugin to the vision that he thinks that war is currently supporting. In other words, that would be a hard hit for Dugin and for Russia to take, in his view. So he sometimes has talked about the current war, special military operation, like it's a matter of life and death for a Eurasian Russia. If Russia loses, it's going to be a big problem. And a lot of people, obviously, it's the opposite for them. It's not a big problem. It would be it would be the best thing that could happen for them. So that just shows you that there's a debate and a dispute about, not only what will happen, but the meaning of what will happen. So in that sense, because Putin took a step, you could put it this way, because the recent special military operation or war was Putin taking a step closer to Dugin's vision of Russia and its place in the world. Therefore, Putin's loss is all the more the loss of Dugin's vision, if that's how it plays out. The meaning of the war is in dispute here. And its meaning for world order and world history is clearly, both for liberal Democrats and for Russian Eurasianists, a fascinating ideological question. Does this mean democracy and freedom triumphant again? Does it mean the dark forces of authoritarian tyranny triumphant again? Or does it mean something like what Dugin is imagining here, a step in the direction of the Great Awakening? That's how we can set out the problem, and then people have to see for themselves what they think.
Ivan Ilyin was a fascist philosopher of the 20s, 30s, and 40s, but he's probably the most important example of how old ideas can be brought back in the 21st century or in a postmodern context. Ilyin had three very important ideas. The first was that social advancement was impossible because the political system, the social system, is like a body. So you're a cell, you're an embryo, you're an organ. You have a place in this larger body. And freedom means knowing your place. That's what freedom means. A second idea that he had is that democracy is a ritual. So we can vote, but we only vote in order to affirm our collective support for a leader. The leader's not legitimated by our votes or chosen by our votes. The voting is just a ritual by which we collectively, every couple of years, endorse a leader who has emerged from some other place, from some, in fascism, leader is some kind of hero who emerges from fiction, who emerges from myth. The third idea Ilyin had, which is very useful, is that the factual world doesn't count. It's not real. Ilyin says that God created the world, but that was a mistake. The world was a kind of aborted process. The world is a horrifying thing because it's full of this and that and the other thing, what we call facts. And those facts can't be unified into some kind of larger whole. So the world is actually horrifying, and those facts are disgusting and of no value whatsoever. So if you're Vladimir Putin and you're governing as the head of an oligarchical clan, it's very comfortable to be able to say, well, look, freedom consists in knowing your place in society. There's no possibility for social advance. If you're Vladimir Putin and you don't have serious democracy or you don't want to have it, it's very comfortable to do, as he in fact has done, it's very comfortable to transform elections into a kind of ritual. And likewise, if you can't have the rule of law and if Russians are basically stuck in a certain place economically and politically, the idea that the world is not factual, that the world is just subjective, that it's just a matter of this opinion, that opinion, the other opinion, is very comfortable. And Ilyin adds the even more comfortable conclusion that the only true thing is Russian nationalism. The only hope to bring the whole world together is that somehow Russia, which is an innocent victim of the rest of the world, will somehow restore itself in some totalitarian form and then bring order back to the world. So interestingly, it's not the only thing which is going on, but interestingly, these kinds of ideas help Mr. Putin as he consolidates a certain kind of authoritarianism by spectacle at home, and also help him as he broadcasts it abroad.
So one of the reasons that I wanted to have you on the show today is because we're talking about, is Vladimir Putin a psychopath? And so I thought we would just go back and kind of think about some of the stuff that we know about Vladimir Putin to try to pick it apart. So this is a guy who doesn't show any emotion when humans are being killed. And you remember back at the whole Kursk story?
Yeah, so what happens is he's just got into power. It's, I think it's August 2000, and he was elected in March. And then suddenly this enormous Russian nuclear submarine, the Kursk, sinks. There's been an explosion, but at least some of the submariners are still alive. There's something like about 100 submariners on the ship. And there are people who can save these submariners. What's happened is there's a big explosion, and the submarine is now sitting on the bottom of the Arctic Ocean somewhere. The Royal Navy and the Norwegian Navy have got skilled people, divers and stuff, and the escape systems that they can actually rescue the trapped Soviet or Russian submariners. But of course, that would be an embarrassment and a humiliation if you're an idiot who cares about these things. And what happened was, rather than a ferocious race to save these guys' lives, there was nothing. There was no signal. Putin was on holiday in his dacha on the Black Sea, and there was complete silence. And eventually he came back, and he was asked in an interview, a TV interview, well, what about the Kursk? And he just looked at the interviewer and said, it sank. So what's fascinating about Putin is that he never prospered inside the KGB. He got inside the KGB, and he was impeccable working class. He was really poor background, but that suited somebody like him very, very well. And he's smart, good at German, and he should have got a good job inside the KGB, i.e. Bonn, West Germany, possibly. His English isn't bad. I've met him, and his English isn't bad. He could have gone to London, New York, Washington. No, he got a rubbish posting in Dresden, East Germany, Stasi-land. Why? Because a story is told in first person, his ghosted autobiography, that his KGB assessor, when he'd finished KGB training school, told him, or wrote of him in a report, that he had no empathy for other people, and he made incredibly rash decisions where there was no risk analysis. And Bill, I'd like to shake the hand of that KGB colonel or general who wrote that report. The problem is, I don't think I can, because I would imagine that Putin, the moment he got power, would have had him killed.
He's had a lot of people killed, hasn't he? I mean,
yes. I mean, the reason I wrote my book, Killer in the Kremlin, was because I was sick, just like you, of the West backing down and running away. And when Putin does a terrible thing, all the West does is we give him the balance of doubt yet and yet again, and he carries on murdering people again and again and again.
When Putin first became prime minister, he was actually the number 4 choice of Yeltsin. Yeltsin had chosen 3 other guys who didn't work out to be the potential successor to Yeltsin. And one of the things which people don't talk about enough is how Putin came to power, what Putin did. Nobody knew who Putin was. He was a complete unknown. He was like a nobody. Yeltsin appoints him as prime minister, and he needs to become popular enough to become president. And so there were the apartment bombs.
He blew up Russia.
And
now, the way I say that, by the way, is when I say he blew up Russia, I say it in complete conviction this is true. And what happened was there was a series of apartment bombs in southern Russia and in Moscow, and the Chechen terrorists, who do exist, they are real, were blamed for this atrocity. And that what Putin did deliberately was get the KGB to murder 300 Russians in their bed so that he could look strong.
And that he can blame it on the Chechens.
On the Chechens, and therefore he had the second Chechen war.
And then he could start a war.
Yes.
And his approval ratings went through the roof.
Yes, and he, from the moment he was Mr. Nobody, and then he became Mr. Tough Guy, on the basis of the Moscow apartment bombs.
His approval ratings go through the roof. This is year 2000 or so. His approval ratings start to decline into 2008. And in 2008,
he invades Georgia. And then they go up again. And then it goes down again. And then in 2014, he invades
Crimea.
He takes Crimea. Very little, hardly any blood loss there. But then he sends his troops under disguise into the Donbass, and there's a terrible bloody war there. And then the Russians make a mistake. They send a Buk missile to knock out Ukrainian fighters from the sky. They make a mistake and they knock out MH17. Now, this was a war crime. 298 people, crew and innocent passengers, most of them holiday makers, many of them Australian, Dutch, Malaysian, 10 Brits, some Americans, were shot out of the sky by the Russians, and the West's response was pitifully inadequate. By the way, what we have running along this as a kind of another beat, if we're looking at a piece of really dark music, is the assassinations of anybody who causes him trouble.
Yeah.
And I believe that there were 3. The first big assassination is of Litvinenko. Why is Putin obsessed with poisoning people? My reasoning is that there's a moment in his ghosted autobiography, first person, he talks about chasing a rat with a stick, and then the rat turns on him, and forever onwards he thinks, when you've got a problem with somebody, you've got to hit them first. But the other thing is, killing rats with sticks is a terribly inefficient way of killing rats. The really good way is to use rat poison. And I think Putin, from a very early age, becomes obsessed with using really fancy poisons. And first of all, you have polonium-210, and then the next poison is even more expensive, more fiendish, more fancy, utterly untraceable, Novichok. And that's what he uses against Skripal. And then when Bellingcat and other great investigators get going, there's multiple more.
So Putin, he goes on these camping trips with horses and
denial of his bisexuality, which would explain, for example, why promoting homosexuality has become illegal on his watch.
So you have a friend named Semen Gluzman, who's quoted as saying Putin is not mad in the clinical psychiatric sense.
He was the first Soviet psychiatrist to condemn the Soviet abuse of psychiatry, and he spent 10 years in the Gulag because of this, and therefore he's an expert on the KGB mindset. He understands the KGB mentality better than anyone else. Since they freed him from the Gulag, he's now in Kyiv, and he's got to know lots of ex-KGB people who are Ukrainian, and they all say, being in the KGB is kind of weird and dark and dangerous, but Putin was bad even for us. Semyon is absolutely clear. As a psychiatrist, Putin is not mad in that he doesn't have hallucinations. He doesn't hear things that people can't hear. He is sane. He is not mad, but he's bad, like Hitler or Stalin or Mao.
But a psychopath doesn't have to have hallucinations. A psychopath can just be a person who has no conscience, no empathy, who kills people, etc.
Yes.
And that it looks like
listen,
from the outside, the guy is evil.
Bill, if it goes quack, it's a duck. Vladimir Putin is a psychopath. I've no doubt about it whatsoever. He is pitiless. He shows no remorse. He lies so smoothly. He lies because there is no sense of morality in this man. And there's another psychiatrist friend of mine, is a guy called Jim Fallon, who's professor of psychiatry at the University of California. And he says it's very, very common for people, and he says people like Hitler, Stalin, Mao, and Putin, all of them, he believes, they lost their natural mother very, very early on, and or they were sexually abused or violated or abused very, very early on, like when they were a toddler, 2, 3 years old. And so what you've got is somebody who is a kind of pitiless enemy of humanity, who is monstrously capable of manipulating other people around him, and yet is completely unbothered by the suffering of others. And this guy is in charge of all of these nuclear weapons and the Russian state.
We're now going to hear from Dr. Arthur Cassidy, a chartered psychologist and associate fellow of the British Psychological Society.
The issue here is that this uniqueness that he does have, it combines the authoritarian personality type, it combines the lack of emotional empathy, manipulation, control. He is a guy who actually will know the mind of Zelensky. He will read Zelensky's mind. And part of this psychopathy, as we call it, or the dark triad, is a combination of traits associated with malignant narcissism and sadism. And so this is nothing to do with sexual sadism, this is political sadism. And this is where people, leaders like President Putin, they don't care who they kill. They don't care how many hundred or thousands they kill. That is irrelevant. What they want, they will get. So, I mean, they will stop at absolutely nothing to fulfill their political ideological aims, objectives. The type of personality structure that he does manifest would be seen to suggest that he is the most powerful individual in the entire world. There is a grandiosity associated with this. And this is a grandiosity, an excessive sense of his own self-worth. And it would put him on a paramount, way above any world leader. There is this social comparison. He has, I'm sure he would have compared himself ideologically and politically in terms of his war efforts, of his power drives. And he would have done this in a way that to make him stand out from the crowd. And so this is a form of dark narcissism. This is where you really zoom in towards who you are in this very introspective way. And you're saying, I will get what I want in any part of the world. I will take control. And it is a very highly form of emotional manipulation and political trickery. He's a predator. We know this has been cited in the literature. He's a political predator. He will go where no one else will go. And this demonstrates what we call fearless dominance. So there's a strong form of fearless dominance in his entire personality. And he acts this out by taking control. no cost, he will win the war. That's what he thinks. And he will not stop at what he wants to achieve his objectives politically and also through the war effort.
And I graduated business school in 1989, which was the year that the Berlin Wall came down. And as I was trying to figure out what to do with my life and my career, I had an epiphany, which is that if my grandfather was the biggest communist in America, I'm going to try to become the biggest capitalist in Eastern Europe. And that's what I set out to do. So I had several jobs. I was at the Boston Consulting Group first in their East European practice area. They sent me out to a little town in Poland to advise on a bus factory that was going bankrupt. And I couldn't save the bus factory, but I noticed one day that my interpreter was carrying around a newspaper under his arm. And on the newspaper, there was a bunch of financial figures. And I said, "What's that?" And he said, "It's the very first privatization in Poland." And I said, "Oh, that's interesting. Can you explain it to me?" And so we sat down in his office, and we started going through the numbers. And the first one was the number of shares outstanding of one of the companies that was being privatized. Next number was the price of the shares, and I did the math, and that was $80 million multiplied, the shares outstanding by the price. And then I said, "What's this line?" And he said, "This is net profit, last year's net profit." I said, "No, just read it." I said, "Net profit." That was $160 million. So you don't have to be like some kind of financial genius to know that if you can buy a company for half of 1 year's earnings, that's probably a good deal. I mean, it's different than this whole venture capital thing that you guys do, which where the earnings are out in the future. But so this is half of 1 year's earnings, and I thought, I didn't know anything about investing. I'd never invested a penny before that, but I thought, isn't this what you're like? This is why I went to business school, to do this. And so I had a total savings of $2,000, and I took my savings down to the post office. I converted it to Polish zloty, and I invested in these privatizations, and my $2,000 investment went up 10 times. And that's when you have in 1 year, and when you have a 10-bagger, it releases a certain chemical in your stomach, and you want to repeat the experience. And so I knew exactly what I wanted to do, and that was to be an investor in Eastern Europe. I then end up at Salomon Brothers as an investment banker at the very beginning of the Russian privatization program. And at Salomon Brothers, my very first assignment was to advise a fishing fleet located in Murmansk, Russia, which is a couple hundred miles north of the Arctic Circle, on their privatization. And so the head of the fishing fleet takes me out to see one of the boats. And it's this enormous vessel. It's like 400 feet long. There's all these nets on the top where they catch the fish, and then the fish get processed throughout this boat. And at the bottom, they actually have canning machines putting them in cans. And so it's not just a fishing boat, it's an ocean-going factory. Very impressive. I asked him, how much does one of these things cost? $20 million new. How many do you have in your fleet? 100. So 20 million times 100, 2 billion. What's the age of your fleet? 7 years. Now, I don't know anything about fishing or shipping, but I figure that makes it half depreciated. So $1 billion worth of ships. And I had been hired by the management of this fishing fleet to advise them on whether to exercise their legitimate right under the privatization program of Russia to buy 51%. And I asked him, at what price is the government selling 51%? And he said, $2.5 million. Let me just repeat the math. There's $1 billion worth of ships, and you can buy 51% for $2.5 million. So if that chemical had been released in my stomach before, now I was really wanting to repeat the exercise, and this was much better than the situation in Poland. And I was wondering whether this was something just going on in the fishing industry or the shipping or I don't know what. And it turns out that this was going on across the board all over Russia. In order to go from communism to capitalism, they decided to give everything away for free to create a bunch of capitalists. And so I ended up leaving Salomon Brothers, setting up an investment fund called the Hermitage Fund, moving to Moscow in 1996, and starting to invest. And it went unbelievably well. I started with almost no capital, and again, it wasn't like the funds you have here, where you raise fund 1 or 2 or 3 or 4. This was an open-ended fund where people could put their money in on a monthly basis. And my first month, I think I was up 45%, and so people wanted to put it in, put their money in. Next month is up 36%. And by the time I guess by 18 months in, I was up 865%. And I'd gone from $25 million to $1 billion of assets under management, which was just an enormous, this was back in the days when $1 billion was real money. And it was just an enormous amount of money, and an even more enormous amount of money for Russia. And then what happened was, in 1998, the Russian government defaulted on their debt. They devalued their currency by 75%. And I lost $900 million of my $1 billion that I was managing. I went down 90%, which was horrifying because I was the face of the Russian stock market on the way up, and I became the face of the collapse on the way down. And I was even more horrified because I had convinced all these skeptical investors to give me money to manage, and I'd lost them 90% of their money. And so I was determined to try to get their money back. But at that moment in time, I discovered something really terrible, which is that the oligarchs, these people we all now know of, who owned, in most cases, between 51 and 96% of these companies, these oligarchs had behaved themselves up until that moment in time because they wanted access to Wall Street. There are all these fancy bankers from Goldman Sachs and Morgan Stanley who are running around Moscow with their Hermes ties, telling all these bankers that they could get money from Wall Street under the one condition that they didn't rip off their minority investors. And before this crash, the oligarchs were like, I don't know if I can do that, but I'd really like free money. And so a lot of them behaved themselves and didn't rip off their minority investors. And so, but after the crash, after everything went down 90% and after the currency was devalued, none of them had any incentive whatsoever to behave themselves, and there's never been any disincentive against misbehavior. And so the oligarchs embarked on an orgy of stealing, which has been unprecedented in the history of business. They were doing asset stripping, transfer pricing, embezzlement, dilution, everything on an industrial scale. And so I decided that, not as a good investment strategy, but as my only survival strategy, they were going to try to steal the last 10 cents on the dollar that I had. And I needed to just stop them. And so I decided to try to stop them from stealing. And there wasn't exactly like I had a lot of tools at my disposal. You couldn't go to the regulator and say these guys are stealing because the regulators were all cut in on the action. You couldn't go to the police, couldn't go to the parliament, couldn't go anywhere really. The only thing that I could do was I could research how they were doing the stealing and then publicize the research. Now you may think to yourself, well, how is it possible to research stealing in Russia? It's a very opaque place. It's a very secretive place. Well, it turns out that it isn't. Russia is actually an incredibly transparent place for a reason that you would never expect. So Russia is the most bureaucratic country in the world. If you go to the bathroom, you got to write your name on the sheet outside the bathroom. And then some guy in some ministry is collecting all that information and entering it on a database. And they're doing it in bathrooms, they're doing it at oil wells, and they're doing it in tax registries, they're doing it everywhere. Everything is the most bureaucratic country in the world, and all the information is being collected by these ministries. And the people in the ministries are paid almost nothing. And so in order for them to survive, they have to sell the information. And so if we were in Russia and I was having a meeting with any of you and I wanted to do a bit of due diligence in advance of the meeting, I could buy your bank statement, find out how much money you have in your account. I could buy your medical records, figure out if you have any embarrassing diseases. I could find out where you've traveled to. I could find out who you've been calling on your mobile phone. I could find out anything. Same thing is true with these companies. And so we were actually able to put together the most unbelievable dossiers of corruption and theft at big Russian companies like Gazprom, Sberbank, Unified Energy Systems. And then I would take this research and I would share it with journalists from the Wall Street Journal, the Financial Times, New York Times, Washington Post, Business Week. And the journalists loved me because I was saving them all sorts of research and work that they needed to do. And I started publicizing these scandals just at the same time that Vladimir Putin had come to power. Now, Vladimir Putin then was a different guy than he is now. And he might have been the same individual, but he wasn't this tyrannical, self-confident, vicious man. He was this very little man who didn't have power at all. The presidency, all the powers of the president had effectively been usurped by these oligarchs. And so his big job when he first came into office was to try to return some of the powers of the presidency that had been lost. And so he was fighting with the same guys I was fighting with. The oligarchs were stealing power from him at the same time as they were stealing money from me. And so when I started to publicize these scandals, Putin would step in. And he would do things like using the state's shares to fire the CEO or to issue a presidential decree to do something or to change the law in some way. And as a result of that, the value, so I went from 25 million to $1 billion down to 100 million. And as Putin was going through this exercise and as I was naming and shaming, I went from 100 million to $4.5 billion. It was up 45 times from the bottom of the market. And obviously I felt pretty good about myself as a fund manager. And I felt pretty good about Putin actually too, because here was this guy who was like, we were on the same side trying to go after the bad guys. And I had the best job in the world, making money and doing good in the same job. But it turned out that Putin's interest was not necessarily to clean up Russia. He just wanted to get rid of the guys he was fighting with, the oligarchs. And so one day at the end of 2003, he decided to win his war with the oligarchs by arresting a man named Michael Khodorkovsky, who was the owner of Yukos, the oil company. He surrounded his private jet in Siberia, arrested him, brought him back to Moscow, put him on trial, and allowed the television cameras to come into the courtroom and film the richest man in Russia on trial sitting in a cage. Now imagine you're the 17th richest guy in Russia and you see a guy far richer, far more powerful, far smarter than you, sitting in a cage, what's your natural reaction? You don't want to sit in that cage yourself. And one by one, these guys went to Putin and said, Vladimir, what do we have to do so we don't sit in a cage? And he said, real simple, 50%. Not 50% for the Russian government or 50% for the presidential administration of Russia, 50% for Vladimir Putin. And that was the moment that Putin became the richest man in the world. And that was the moment that my interests and his diverged. In November of 2005, so this is about a year and a half after this whole thing, I was flying back to Moscow from a weekend trip to London, and I was arrested at the border. I was detained for 15 hours at the Sheremetyevo Airport Detention Center. I wasn't sure whether I was going to Siberia or being deported. And thankfully, the next morning, they put me on an Aeroflot flight and sent me back to London and subsequently declared me a threat to national security of Russia. Now, this was a big shock. I was a specialist investing in Russia. I had a $4.5 billion fund. Not being allowed to get into Russia definitely wasn't going to be good for business. But I understood that when the Russians turn on you, they don't tend to do so mildly. They do so with extreme prejudice. And being kicked out is a pretty mild sanction. So I said to myself, what else can they do? They could arrest my people, or they could seize my assets. And so I organized an emergency evacuation of all of my staff, and I was able to get all of them and all of their family members safely out of Russia. And once everybody was out, we then quickly and quietly liquidated our portfolio in Russia, and we got all of our money out, safe. I breathed a big sigh of relief. I dusted off my hands. I said, maybe I'll write a book about this someday. Time to invest elsewhere. I set up a new investment fund. I thought if I could invest in Russia, I could handle any emerging market after that. I set up this emerging market fund, started investing in other parts of the world. And about 18 months after that, I'm having a board meeting for my new fund in Paris. And I get this frantic call from the one employee I've left in Russia, who was a secretary, who was the lone person manning my empty office in Moscow, who I never spoke to, because I didn't think I kept the office in case the storm ever blew over, but I never thought that there was no reason to speak to her, because there's just nothing going on there. And she's in hysterics, and she said, there's 25 police officers in the office right now, drilling the safe and raiding the office. What should I do? And I said, I don't know. Let me call up our lawyer. So I have an American lawyer in Moscow who I used for all my legal stuff. And I call him up. He sounds pretty distracted when I get him on the phone. And I tell him there's 25 police officers in my office. And he says, there's 25 police officers in my office looking for your documents. 50 police officers raiding both of our offices looking for the stamps, seals, and certificates for our investment holding companies, which at this point were empty. They find them at the law firm's office. They seize those documents. And the next thing we know, we no longer own our investment holding companies. They've been fraudulently re-registered using the documents seized by the police, registered into the name of a man who had been convicted of manslaughter and let out of jail early by the police. Now, there was no financial loss for me because we had sold everything the year before. But I'm thinking to myself, if the police are working, stealing companies and doing identity theft, you're working with murderers, I'm going to be walking through Frankfurt Airport one day and there's going to be some arrest warrant for me. I need to stop this. And so I go out and hire the smartest lawyer I know in Russia, a young man named Sergei Magnitsky, to help me figure this whole thing out and to stop it. I send him out to investigate. He investigates and he comes back and he says, I figured out what's going on and it's not pretty. He said, there's two parts to the scam. The first part was they wanted to steal all of your money, but it failed because you took your money out. He said, however, the second part succeeded. And what he explained was that when we sold everything, after I'd been kicked out, we had a profit of $1 billion, and we paid to the Russian government $230 million of capital gains tax. And what Sergei had figured out was that the people who stole our companies went to the tax authorities, and they said there was a mistake made in the previous year's tax filing. These companies didn't earn $1 billion. They earned zero. And they came up with a complicated way of explaining this. Therefore, the $230 million of taxes was paid in error, and we'd like that money back. It was the largest tax refund in the history of Russia. They applied for it on the 23rd of December, 2007. And it was approved and paid out the next day. So if I had legitimately overpaid $5,000 of taxes in 2006, I'd still be waiting for that refund right now. But they were able to get a $230 million tax refund in one day on Christmas Eve, the largest tax refund in the history of Russia. Now, Sergei and I were convinced that Putin is a nationalist and a patriot. He might be a bad guy, but would he allow his own officials to steal $230 million of their money? This was not my money. This was tax money, their own tax money. And we were sure that if this was just brought to the attention of the right people, the top people, that the good guys would get the bad guys. And so we wrote criminal complaints to every different branch of Russian law enforcement. I gave interviews to all the TV, radio, newspapers explaining the scam. Sergei gave sworn testimony to the Russian State Investigative Committee, their version of the FBI. And we sat back and waited for the good guys to get the bad guys. Well, it turns out that in Putin's Russia, there are no good guys. And 5 weeks after Sergei testified, the same police officers he testified against came to his home on the 24th of November 2008. They arrested him, they threw him in pretrial detention, and then they began to torture him to get him to withdraw his testimony. They put him in cells with 14 inmates in 8 beds and left the lights on 24 hours a day to impose sleep deprivation. They put him in cells with no heat and no window panes in December in Moscow, so he nearly froze to death. They put him in cells with no toilet, just a hole in the floor where the sewage would bubble up. They'd move him from cell to cell to cell in the middle of the night. And the purpose of all this was to get him to withdraw his testimony against the corrupt police officers. And they wanted to get him to sign a false confession. They moved him from the prison that had a medical facility to a maximum security prison called Butyrka, which is considered to be one of the most horrific and most awful prisons in Russia. And most significantly for Sergei, at Butyrka, they have no medical facilities. And at Butyrka, his health completely breaks down. He goes into a terrible downward spiral, constant agonizing pain. He's desperate for medical attention. He and his lawyers write 20 different desperate requests for medical attention to every different branch of the criminal justice system. And every one of those requests was either ignored or denied in writing. On the night of November 16th, 2009, Sergei Magnitsky went into critical condition. On that night, the Butyrka authorities didn't want to have responsibility for him anymore. So they put him in an ambulance and sent him across town to a different prison that had a medical wing. But when he arrived there, instead of putting him in the emergency room, they put him in an isolation cell. They chained him to a bed, and 8 riot guards with rubber batons beat him until he died. That was November 16th, 2009, 13 years ago. Sergei Magnitsky was 37 years old. He left a wife and 2 children. I got the news the very next day, and it was the most horrific, traumatic, heartbreaking, life-changing news I could have ever gotten. Sergei Magnitsky was killed because he worked for me. He was killed as my proxy, and he'd still be alive today if he hadn't been my lawyer. And so when I was finally able to clear the fog of heartbreak and hysteria, to think clearly, I made a vow to his memory, to myself, and to his family that I was going to put aside everything else that I was doing and devote all of my time, all of my energy, and all my resources to go after the people who killed him to make sure they face justice. And for the last 13 years, that's what I've been doing. Originally, I thought there was some chance of getting justice inside of Russia. Sergei had written everything down. He wrote, during his 358 days in detention, he wrote 450 criminal complaints documenting who did what to him, where they did it, how they did it, when they did it. He would write these up by hand, hand them to his lawyer once a month. The lawyer would file them. They would be ignored or denied, but we got copies. And from those copies, we had the most well-documented case of human rights abuse that's probably ever come out of Russia. And from that, I thought that they'd have to throw at least some of the low-level people under the bus. They'd have to prosecute somebody for this horrific crime. But that didn't happen. They circled the wagons. The Putin regime circled the wagons. They gave promotions and state honors to some of the people who were most complicit. Putin personally got involved in exonerating every single official involved. And in the most cynical and despicable miscarriage of justice, they put Sergei Magnitsky on trial 3 years after they killed him, in the first ever trial against a dead man in the history of Russia. They put me on trial as his co-defendant. We were both found guilty. They couldn't do anything more than killing him. They sentenced me to 9 years in absentia. It became obvious well before this crazy trial that we weren't going to get any justice in Russia. So I said, how do we get justice outside of Russia? And that's when I came up with this idea, which is that these people who killed Sergei did it because they did it to steal $230 million. They don't keep that money in Russia. They keep that money in the West. And we've all seen it. I mean, the Russian money is sloshing around everywhere, in Manhattan and South Beach and the French Riviera and the Swiss Alps, and they send their kids to boarding school in England and their girlfriends on shopping trips to Milan and all sorts of other things like that. And so I came up with this idea, which is we may not be able to prosecute them for a torture and murder that took place in Russia. We can't prosecute them in the West for that, but we certainly don't have to allow them to come here and spend their money here. And so I took this idea to Washington, and I presented this story, shared the same story I've just shared with you tonight with with these with two senators, Senator Benjamin Cardin, a Democrat from Maryland, and the late John McCain, Republican from Arizona. And I said, can we ban the visas and freeze the assets of these people who killed Sergei Magnitsky? And they said yes. And that became the Magnitsky Act. Now, originally it was just for Sergei Magnitsky. And when they put it onto the law books to be voted on, their phones immediately started lighting up from other victims in Russia who said, you found the Achilles heel of the Putin regime. This is what they do. They commit terrible crimes, kill people, imprison people, do all this type of stuff in Russia. And then they take their money to the West. Can you please sanction the people who killed my father, my husband, my sister, my aunt? And after about a dozen of these calls, these two senators realized they were onto something much bigger than just one case. They added 65 words to the law to include all gross human rights abusers in Russia. And then all of a sudden, all these other victims came out, fanned out across Capitol Hill, told their stories. And when it went for a vote in the Senate in November of 2012, it passed 92-4. It passed the House of Representatives with 89%, and it became a federal law on December 14th, 2012, the Magnitsky Act. Vladimir Putin went out of his mind. He was so angry. He banned the adoption of Russian orphans by American families in retaliation. He made it his single largest foreign policy priority to try to repeal the Magnitsky Act. He even sent his own emissary to Trump Tower on June 9th, 2016, a woman named Natalia Veselnitskaya, to meet with Donald Trump Jr., Jared Kushner, and Paul Manafort. This was after Trump was nominated, but before he was elected, with one specific request: to repeal the Magnitsky Act. I'm very happy that that didn't happen, and it couldn't happen because the Magnitsky Act was an act of Congress, and Trump couldn't just sign an executive order and get rid of it. It would require 51% of Congress, and if they were voting 92-4 a few years before, they weren't going to repeal it. In fact, Congress did something even better, which was they expanded the Magnitsky Act just before Trump was elected. It became the Global Magnitsky Act. Instead of just targeting Russian human rights abusers, it targeted Chinese human rights abusers and Iranian human rights abusers and Venezuelan human rights abusers, from all sorts of bad guys from all over the world. I'm here also to talk about current events, because there's a lot to talk about in current events, but I think it's important to tell that story, and I think it's also important to tell that story because I think a lot of the current events are connected to this Magnitsky story. In my second book, it's called Freezing Order, and a big part of it is about us tracing who got the $230 million. And what we discovered was that one of the beneficiaries was Vladimir Putin. He didn't get it in his own name. Some of you may remember the Panama Papers. The Panama Papers was a leak from a law firm in Panama called Mossack Fonseca. Apparently I think some secretary who was going out with the managing director was mistreated by him, and she decided to leak the entire database of the entire law firm. And every country had a hero or an anti-hero. And the anti-hero of Russia was a man named Sergei Dugin. And Sergei Dugin had a very interesting backstory, which is he was a cellist from St. Petersburg. And the Panama Papers had these unbelievable details of how this cellist from St. Petersburg ended up getting $2 billion from oligarchs and Russian state banks. And I mean, the next richest cellist in the world is Yo-Yo Ma with 25 million, and this is a Russian cellist that no one's ever heard of, has got 2 billion. And everyone said, why did this cellist get all this money? And the answer is because he's Putin's best friend from childhood. He's the godfather of Putin's daughter, and one of his daughters, and he introduced Putin to his wife, and he's Putin's proxy, he's Putin's nominee. This is how Putin stores his money. And the most interesting thing we discovered for ourselves was that in our money laundering investigation, which I've conducted for 12 years, we discovered that Sergei Dugin got some of the money from the Magnitsky case. And so Putin got some of the money, which explains a lot about why he was so eager to cover this crime up. And as we continued our money laundering investigation, we discovered that one of the main banks that laundered the money was a Danish bank called Danske Bank. And they laundered 200 million of the 230 million through their Estonian branch. And we were able to verify this from data that we had gotten from whistleblowers and other data leaks. And once we figured this out, we were contacted by a Danish investigative journalist team who had gotten another big data leak of all sorts of account information, but they couldn't make any sense of it because we had determined from our data the names of the accounts and the account holders and all this kind of stuff in this Danske Bank. They wanted to see our data. And so we gave them our data. They compared it with their data leak, which was called the Russian laundromat. And they called us back and they said, it's actually not 200 million that was laundered through this Danish bank, it was 8.3 billion. And so they published the article in their newspaper, and it was the most well-read article in the history of their newspaper. And Denmark is a country which is supposed to be really squeaky clean. It's the #2 country on the Transparency International Index. And the CEO of the bank couldn't just shrug it off and not do anything about it. And so he ordered a special external audit of the whole thing. And he was maybe hoping that the auditors, the law firm and the accounting firm and the data analysis, they'd come back and say, actually, the journalists weren't right. But they came back with their external audit, and they came back and discovered that it wasn't 8.3 billion, it was 234 billion that had been laundered from Russia. Now, this is just one bank that we could lift the hood on, one Danish bank. If we could lift the hood on Raiffeisen Bank in Vienna, on UBS and Credit Suisse in Switzerland, on Deutsche Bank in Germany, I think we would get a number closer to $1 trillion of money that was stolen by Putin and the 1,000 people around him from Russia. $1,000 billion. And I think this explains everything. So you can steal a smaller amount of money over a shorter period of time and probably get away with it. But to steal $1 trillion, this is money that should have been spent on hospitals and schools and roads and public services, and instead it was spent on jets and yachts and so on and so forth. You can do this for 1 year, 3 years, 5 years, but you just can't do this for 22 years without the people eventually rising up. And Putin understands very clearly that if at some point the Russian people were to rise up and want to get rid of him, there's no, he can't do like George Bush and set up the Putin Presidential Library and paint, or like Boris Johnson, sit on the back bench and give speeches for $250,000 a pop. If Putin were to lose power, he'd lose his money, he'd go to jail, and he'd die. And so for Putin, he's got to stay in power forever. He understands that. It's a question of life and death. And for Putin to stay in power forever is a very hard thing if he's just continuing to like tighten and tighten and tighten the screws and take away and create this pressure cooker environment. And particularly in this moment in time, if we look at it, after COVID, you have all of these leaders that are losing their jobs. Mario Draghi lost his job. Bolsonaro is going to lose his job. Boris Johnson lost his job. The guy from Israel lost his job. All democratic leaders are losing their jobs. And so if there's anything, it was going to happen to him. And so what does a dictator do when they're afraid they're going to lose their job, that the people are going to rise up against them? Machiavelli 101. Read The Prince, Machiavelli the Prince. You create a foreign enemy, you go to war. This war is not about NATO enlargement. This war is not about Putin's legacy. There's a lot of people saying that he wants to create a great Russian empire for his legacy. If he cared about his legacy, he wouldn't have stolen $1 trillion from his people. That's just not what a person does who wants legacy. This war is about a small-minded criminal who's stolen a lot of money, who's desperate to stay in power. And that is a very important conclusion, because if that's the case, then these proposals are like from Elon Musk says, well, let's just give them let's just give the Russians 4 territories and declare Ukraine neutral and to avoid war. None of that avoids any war at all, because Putin, he doesn't care about that stuff. He just wants to be at war. And so there's only one of 2 outcomes that can come from this whole thing. Either the Russians win or the Ukrainians win. And if the Russians win in Ukraine, then I guarantee you they're going to be at the Estonian border next. And if they're at the Estonian border next, they'll point their guns at Estonia, which is a NATO member, and probably point a few nukes at us, and then watch us go crazy on our talk shows about, wait a second, why do we have this Article 5 of NATO where we have to go to war with Russia? The Americans, the British, and the Russians and the Ukrainians signed a treaty called the Budapest Memorandum, where they basically said if they give up their nuclear weapons, we would guarantee their integrity, their territorial integrity. The Ukrainians gave up their nuclear weapons, and what happens? We also, well, actually, it wasn't a treaty, it was just a memorandum, so never mind. I guarantee you that we would have that same conversation about NATO, and that's what Putin would be hoping for. And if we have that conversation and then we give up NATO, then all hell is going to break loose in the world. And so we cannot allow the Ukrainians to lose this war. And at the moment, we've given the Ukrainians enough so they're not losing the war, but we're not giving them enough to win the war. And there's a lot of people in the US government and other governments that are kind of wanting to hold back on giving the Ukrainians what they actually need militarily to win this war. And there's a lot of people that are saying, we don't want, that he's threatening nuclear war. If we're going to cave into his threats of nuclear war right now over Ukraine, then why not just cave over every place? Because, if he's going to do it for Ukraine, why doesn't he do it for Germany or anywhere else? And so this is really an existential, we're at a moment of existential crisis, and the Ukrainians at the moment are doing a good job, but I hate to say this, and people always criticize me for being a bummer speaker, but I'm not sure how I can see this thing ending. I don't see that there is no. It's hard for me to see that the Russians can win this war because the Ukrainians have enough to stop them, but I don't think the Ukrainians have enough to win the war either. And so I can imagine this thing carrying on. And will Putin, do a nuclear attack? He could. He's a psychopath. I think we're a long way away from that. He's got a lot of other things up his sleeve to cause trouble. I mean, who would have thought that he would decide to just bomb every power plant in Ukraine right now before the winter? That's pretty clever. Make them freeze to death in the winter. That's not a bad, sort of out of control military strategy. Could he blow up our internet cables? Sure. Pipelines, absolutely. And all sorts of other stuff that we can't even imagine because no one's ever done it before. That's how Putin is probably going to behave in the coming years and months and so on.